Artist chasing his dreams, and along the way, he connected with a kindred spirit.
My mom met Michael at work and fell in love.
They had like this kind of like glow, sparkle kind of romance.
But their passionate love story was cut short one fateful night.
You've been shot in the head?
She and her boyfriend had been shot and needed assistance immediately.
While two victims cling to life, detectives must unravel what went wrong.
Was this a robbery gone wrong, or was this an execution?
Someone had been stalking her and peeking through our windows.
And when a possible third victim emerges, the investigation goes into overdrive.
I remember asking, where's my sister? Where's Star?
She didn't answer the phone for none of us. She didn't call back or anything. Something had up.
It's a case filled with miracles.
God had other plans. She was still alive.
And monsters.
He was a controlling man, very controlling man.
It was crazy. Only Satan is that controlling.
There are legitimate concerns. Will he do this again?
They found 70 human bones behind a grocery store.
He was the devil's child, I would say.
5th, 2016, Charlotte, North Carolina. It's the last days of a sweltering summer in the Tar Heel State.
Charlotte is one of the fastest growing cities in America, and that's been that way for decades now.
It's a college town, and UNC Charlotte sits right in the middle of University City Boulevard.
It's a wonderful place, just wonderful.
But as night falls on the charming city, a desperate 911 call comes in to local dispatch.
The dispatch received a very unsettling, disturbing call.
The caller identifies herself as 46-year-old Katrina Paul.
She seemed to be in highly distress, and she was stumbling over her words.
Katrina said she'd been shot.
Stop me. He shot me. Okay, where did you wait that? In my head. You were shot in the head? Yes, ma'am.
Katrina goes on to say that she isn't the only victim in need of medical assistance.
She said her fiance, Michael Gretzinger, had also been shot.
Okay, where did you shot at? He's in the head.
By the time police arrive on the scene, Katrina is barely conscious.
You take her, I've got him.
And her fiancé, Michael, is in even more dire shape.
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
He was alive, but barely.
I've got a pulse here.
He was non-responsive and unconscious, unable to communicate to them.
Michael was on the brink of death, and they had to move fast if they wanted to save his life.
38-year-old Army veteran Michael Gretzinger had a passion for creativity.
After concluding his time in the military in 2009, he started pursuing some of his other dreams.
He wanted to pursue an acting career.
He also wrote poetry.
He was always looking out for everybody, trying to lift people up and inspire them.
To fund his passions, Michael started working odd jobs around the Charlotte metropolitan area.
Eventually, he found a job at a grocery store.
And it was there he met 44-year-old Katrina Paul.
My mom met Michael at work. They worked together and became close. He was a cool dude.
You say you write poetry?
Yeah, not like Shakespeare or whatever.
Okay.
More like spoken word stuff.
Well, that's really cool.
Michael was drawn to Katrina's bubbly personality.
My mom's very goofy, and her laughter is amazing as well. She laughs about anything. She talks to anyone, and she hugs everybody. That's the warm spirit in her.
As outgoing as she was, she's like, you know, kind of like the life of the party in a sense. And I think he was like one of those kind of guys where like he didn't meet a stranger.
It wasn't long before the two became more than just co-workers.
They would be around each other, and it was kind of like a puppy love kind of thing. They had that kind of newfound love that felt familiar. I could tell that my mom was happy.
After just 6 months of dating, Michael proposed.
When Michael wanted to take it to the next level with my mom, I gave him my blessing because he was so respectable about it. He didn't want to impose, he didn't want to intrude. And I'm a mama's boy, so that was important to me. It only felt natural that they would be looking for a happily ever after.
And as their wedding day drew near, everything seemed to be going the happy couple's way.
The two started to look for a place to live together, and they found a place in the university area of Charlotte.
She was super excited. We talked about her decorating and decor and things like that.
Michael also found a new job in radio that he really enjoyed.
He went on to become a well-known and respected, fun-loving radio DJ.
For Michael and Katrina, it seemed like the sky was the limit.
They had like this kind of like glow, sparkle kind of romance.
But now, first responders have arrived at the couple's apartment to find them both suffering from gunshot wounds to the head.
Paramedics determined that both were in very serious condition and in need of immediate medical care.
It was a miracle that either of them was still alive.
And as an ambulance rushes them to the closest hospital, their lives hang in the balance.
It quickly became a race against the clock.
It's unclear if either will see the light of day in the morning.
After settling down in Charlotte, North Carolina, 38-year-old Michael Gretzinger was pursuing his dreams with the support and encouragement of the woman he loved, Katrina Paul.
My mom met Michael at work and fell in love. They were together about 6 months before he proposed, and they moved in together.
The engaged couple was looking forward to what the future held in store for them.
I think they just were excited about taking it to the next level. It was like that commitment to each other for the rest of their lives.
But now, it's uncertain if they'll even live through the night as paramedics rush them to the emergency room.
They are both clinging to life.
She had been shot in the head twice and was teetering on the edge of consciousness the entire time. But he was in much worse condition than she was. He was non-responsive.
While ER doctors work to stabilize the couple, detectives arrive at their apartment and begin trying to piece together what happened.
Why would somebody do this to somebody, first of all? And how do we get them behind bars and pay the penalty?
Unfortunately, detectives don't find much evidence left behind.
Investigators do not find any signs of forced entry or robbery at the scene of the crime.
To the detectives, this suggests a crime of methodical execution. Michael and his girlfriend were not the victims of a random crime.
They were targeted by someone they knew.
And one of the responding officers already has a lead on a possible suspect.
I saw someone when we first arrived.
The officer said when he arrived at the apartment complex, he saw a man running with a towel.
Hey!
The officer explains he tried to run after the mysterious individual, but he soon disappeared into the night.
The officer said that he saw him about 60 yards away, and so he wasn't able to give a very good description.
Be on the lookout for a black male, 5'9", green shirt.
Okay.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
Armed with this description, the officers start knocking on the doors of neighbors, looking to see if they can provide any more additional information.
Unfortunately, none of the neighbors has seen a man matching the suspect's description.
None of the people that the officers spoke to reported seeing anyone in a green shirt the night before and actually had no recollection of anyone fitting that description living in the community at all.
Meanwhile, news of the shooting is spreading to Katrina and Michael's loved ones.
I got a call. It was a detective on the phone. He was like, well, I need you to get to Carolina Medical Center. Your mother's been in a fatal accident. I tried to not cry, but I couldn't help it. I was just emotional, and I was a nervous wreck.
As Nikki races to the hospital, she tries to get the rest of her siblings on the phone.
I started calling my brothers, TJ and Ty, my sister as well.
I answered her phone, and there was like my mother was in the hospital, that she's been shot. At the time, I didn't know what was going on, who did it. I just got up and went to the hospital.
I think I was either at work or leaving work in Columbia, South Carolina, when I got that call. And I just remember my colleagues saying, it's not safe for you to drive. You shouldn't drive like this. You're too emotional.
When Katrina's children arrive at the hospital, they're overwhelmed with fear and confusion.
It was just like, it was like everything was stopped. It was in slow motion at that time. Like, I just wanted to see my mama and make sure she was okay at that time.
Seeing my mother on that bed, it was something that I never thought I would see.
Michael was on the same floor of the hospital. I remember wanting to go visit with him and see how he was doing, and I wasn't allowed to.
Detectives are hoping family members might have a lead on who did this to the beloved couple.
They asked me, do I know what happened or did I know? I'm like, sir, no.
Do you know anyone who would want to hurt your mother or Michael?
No. They're just really nice, everyday people, you know?
The family was shocked that this had happened. They were a couple that generally just spent most of their time with each other.
It was nothing I could tell them. I had the slightest idea.
They were very loving, kind, and gentle people. Not the type of couple or individuals to have enemies.
But Nikki says there's something else she needs to tell the investigators.
Me and my brothers, we've been trying to get a hold of our sister Star to let her know what's going on, but she's not answering her phone.
We calling and calling and calling and calling and calling Star. She never picked up. She never answered the phone.
I remember asking, where's my sister? Where's Star?
We're really worried about her.
No one had been able to get in touch with her, and they were unable to reach her by phone for several hours. It was very concerning.
If Star knew what was going on, she would have been there. So a lot of things was just going through my head about what could have happened or what's going on.
Now the family is starting to worry. Could she be another victim in this crime?
38-year-old radio DJ Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée Katrina Paul are undergoing emergency surgery after being shot in the head in their Charlotte apartment.
The couple's loved ones couldn't believe what had just happened. No one can really imagine who could do something like this.
But while speaking to police at the hospital, Katrina's children have just revealed another cause for concern. Their sister, Star Meters, is missing.
Star was the only one that didn't come to the hospital. She didn't show up. She didn't answer the phone for none of us. She didn't call back or anything.
There's absolutely no way that something like this would have happened, and she wouldn't have been by her mother's side.
Just the fact that she's not here right now, something's got to be wrong.
Star's siblings tell the detectives that she was closer to their mother than any of them.
She was more of a mama's girl than me, you know?
She was very passionate about the things that she loved, family being probably number one.
Has your sister ever disappeared like this before? No, never.
My sister's not nowhere to be found, and our mother's laying in the hospital bed. Something ain't adding up.
They're starting to worry she could be another victim in this crime.
You're already looking at 2 victims. It's not a far stretch to think that there might be a third.
When's the last time you spoke with your sister? A few weeks ago, she came over to the house.
She called me and told me she had somebody with her. And when she showed up, the person she had with her was Tim.
Nikki explains that Timothy Crumity is her mother's ex, the man she was with before Michael.
Him and my mother, they dated for some years, but then they broke up a couple years ago.
The family goes on to tell the investigators that Timothy was the pastor of a church nearby in Concord, North Carolina.
The first time I met Tim was in middle school. I was like 12 or 13.
I never liked him at all. Like, I guess it was just the feeling that I got of his presence.
He did a lot of things behind closed doors. Timothy tried to be two different people.
They had an on and off again relationship. You would see him and then you wouldn't.
Katrina's family says that the more turbulent their relationship became, the more Tim showed his true colors.
Over the course of her relationship with Tim, he became more and more controlling.
Abusive physically, I really never seen, but his words was very abusive.
And after over 10 years together, Katrina finally had enough.
She put an end to this on again and off again relationship.
When he came over to our house that day with Starry, he was definitely trying to weasel his way back into our lives. What is he doing here?
Just hear him out.
Listen, I really miss you guys. For a while there, I thought we was family, right?
I guess.
I got you a little something.
He tried to make a peace offering with me. He tried to bring me some liquor.
Thanks, Tim.
I apologize for everything. I hope you forgive me so we can be in each other's lives again.
That's very kind of you.
Tell your mom hello for me, okay?
Star was more forgiving, but Nikki was not buying it.
I'm like, okay, cool. Because people don't like in my house.
I'm the oldest, so I definitely remember more about my mom's relationship with Tim, more than Star does.
Investigators agree that Tim's behavior did seem concerning. They definitely wanted to talk to him, and as soon as possible.
But could a man of God really be capable of this kind of attack?
Hey, come here. You're gonna want to take a look at this.
They were shocked to find that he had an alarming and long criminal history, spanning back as far as 25 years. And this isn't the first time he's been suspected of murder.
North Carolina police investigating the shooting of Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée Katrina Paul have discovered that Katrina's 29-year-old daughter, Star, is also missing.
Nobody could find her. She was just like, she just fell off the earth. I was calling and calling and calling and calling and calling people, but nobody saw her or seen her.
Detectives have also learned that Katrina's volatile ex, Timothy Crumity, had recently been trying to rekindle a relationship with the family.
Timothy is a local pastor at a church in Concord, North Carolina.
But while Tim may preach the word of God, his rap sheet is more befitting of a career criminal.
Hey, come here and take a look at this.
Police records indicated that Tim has spent nearly a decade of his life behind bars.
Timothy was a good manipulator, so he made himself look good, but was also a bad person at the same time.
Arrest records show that Tim's first serious run-in with the law dates back to 1989.
In September of that year, Tim was arrested for armed robbery and receiving stolen goods in Onslow County, North Carolina.
For his crime, Tim was sentenced to 8 years in prison and finally released in 1998.
After he was released, it seemed like Tim was just living a normal, law-abiding citizen type of life.
He got a job with a flooring company in Kannapolis, a city just north of Charlotte, and he was also serving as a pastor for a local church.
But just a few years later, Tim found himself back on the wrong side of the law.
In June of 2005, the boss at the flooring company where Tim worked, Danny Johnson, was found shot to death in a local park.
Danny was last seen alive with Tim at a bank in Charlotte. Danny had loaned Tim $5,000 to pay off a debt.
In September of that same year, police working the case arrested Tim for murder, under the assumption he killed Danny to avoid having to pay back the $5,000 loan.
He spent the next 5 years in Mecklenburg County Jail awaiting trial.
But after a lengthy investigation failed to turn up any physical evidence tying Tim to Danny Johnson's death, the DA was forced to drop the charges for fear of not being able to secure a guilty verdict at trial.
And in 2013, Tim was at the center of yet another homicide investigation.
On July 3rd, 2013, Tim called 911 and claimed that an armed intruder shot his then wife, Sharon.
Tim said he managed to get the gun away from the robber and shot him in the head.
He essentially described it as some sort of robbery gone wrong.
But the evidence at the crime scene didn't add up with Tim's version of events.
The robber was identified as a handyman from the neighborhood, James Luther Banks.
James and Sharon both died of gunshot wounds to the head, while Tim walked away unscathed.
James did not have a history of violent crime, and his family says that he's the furthest thing from a thief or a violent killer.
Compared it to Tim, who already had a criminal record and was suspected in a prior homicide, it just didn't add up.
Despite the suspicions surrounding Tim and his version of events, police could never prove that he was lying, and so he was never actually charged with the death of these two people.
After being involved in 2 homicides, you would think Tim would lay low. But less than 6 months later, he became a subject of another police investigation.
In December 2013, Tim's house burned to the ground. Investigation revealed that he was the person that set his house on fire.
Finally, investigators were able to turn up enough evidence to put Tim behind bars for arson and insurance fraud. But his shady history still doesn't end there.
Shortly after his release from jail, Tim befriended an elderly woman in Rowan County and moved in with her. Tim managed to convince her to appoint him as her power of attorney and was responsible for her estate. Then in April 2016, this woman died under suspicious circumstances, and Tim was the executor of her estate.
There was whispers that he killed her for her money, but that's all they ever were, whispers.
Soon after, Tim moved to Concord, North Carolina for a fresh start and got another job as a preacher. It was there he met Katrina Paul and her family.
It wasn't too much of a big church. It was a growing church, but he was a good preacher.
However, to the investigators in Charlotte, one thing is now clear. Tim Crumedy was far from a righteous man.
Tim was not the servant of God everyone thought he was, the upstanding citizen. Instead, he was a career criminal with a trail of bodies in his wake.
Homicide.
And when detectives receive a call from the hospital where Michael and Katrina are undergoing treatment, it sounds like Tim's body count may have just gone up.
Despite the doctor's best efforts, they were unable to remove the bullets from Michael's brain because they had gone so far through. And unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries.
I sat there as he took actually his last breath.
When I learned that Michael passed away, it hurt me because I knew how much my mother loved Michael. I knew how much Michael loved my mother.
But in spite of the tragic news, there's also a glimmer of hope.
The doctors had better news about Katrina.
Miraculously, neither bullet penetrated her brain.
She was in stable condition.
Okay, we'll be right there.
And she's ready to talk to detectives.
Despite her weak condition, she was very ready to tell them exactly what happened to her.
Homicide detectives in Charlotte, North Carolina are zeroing in on Tim Crumity as the prime suspect in the shootings of Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée, Katrina Paul.
Michael unfortunately passed away from his injuries at the hospital, but doctors were able to save Katrina.
Now that Katrina is out of surgery and in stable condition, she's ready to speak with detectives.
Despite her weak condition, she was very ready to tell them exactly what happened to her.
She tells investigators that there's no doubt in her mind who shot her.
She says it was Tim Crumity.
Timothy. He always put on this persona that he was a great man, that he was a child of God, and he really wasn't.
Katrina tells the detectives when she first met Tim almost 2 decades ago, she had no idea his pious persona was a total sham.
About 2001, my mom came home from church one Sunday. She had a great service and she wanted us to come to church with her next Sunday. I said, okay, cool, we go to church. The pastor was Tim.
Katrina and Tim hit it off from day one.
When she first met Tim, she was enamored by him.
He spoiled my mom, and he did everything that he could to keep her happy.
But once they started dating, Katrina began to see a different side of her pastor boyfriend.
Over time, Tim became more and more controlling in their relationship. He wanted to know who Kim was talking to. Where was she going? Who was she with? When would she be back?
He had been stalking her and peeking through our windows and stuff. It was crazy. Only Satan is that controlling.
Eventually, Katrina realized she needed to find a way out of the relationship.
She had made several attempts to remove Timothy from her life. I think she went about it the way, we're all taught, you don't accept phone calls, you move away.
She took a restraining order out on him because he was crazy. He just became obsessed with her.
Then, in 2014, she met Michael Gretzinger.
She realized when she met Michael that she was with someone who respected her, who loved her.
My mother was happy and in love.
Katrina felt like she'd finally erased him from her life until the night of August 5th, 2016.
Katrina and Michael were supposed to go out on a date that night, but on their way to the restaurant, Katrina realized she had forgotten her phone.
She realized she left her cell phone at home, so they turned around to go back.
But when they arrived back home, there was an unwelcome surprise waiting for them.
Somehow, Timothy found out where my mother lived, and he got into the apartment.
Tim, what are you
Shut
doing
up.
here?
Shut up. You, get over there. Okay. Get on your knees.
Okay. Take it easy. Take it easy.
She watched in horror as Tim forced Michael to his knees.
Then he fired 2 shots into his head.
Timothy shot Michael and left him bleeding on the floor.
But for Katrina, her waking nightmare was only beginning.
He then tied her hands behind her back and forced her into the passenger seat of her own car, and then drove her to his home in Rowan County.
He kept her there for several hours, just trying to figure out what to do, before ultimately putting her back in the car.
From there, Tim drove Katrina to a rural area on the outskirts of Charlotte.
He pulled her out of the car, and Tim told her to turn around.
She thought he was about to untie her and set her free.
But instead, Tim drew his weapon.
He raised his gun and shot her in the back of the head. Once she fell to the ground, he aimed and fired again.
With her ears ringing, Katrina thought for sure she was dying.
But God had other plans. She was still alive.
If Katrina wanted to continue living, Tim couldn't find out that her heart was still beating, and beating faster than ever.
She continued to play dead as Tim loaded her in the trunk of his car and drove her to another location.
When the car stopped and Katrina heard Tim get out, she kept waiting.
She waited in the trunk in darkness, unsure what would happen next.
Eventually, she decided she needed to get help if she was gonna survive.
She started to try and get out of the trunk, pushing against the back of the seat and feeling around to see if there was anything that would help her get out.
My mother got out the trunk from a latch that was in the trunk that you can pull.
As she emerged from the trunk, she was relieved to see she was back at her apartment complex.
Miraculously, she was able to stumble upstairs and call 911.
You want shot in the head? Yes, ma'am.
She was fading, like she was trying to leave, but she was too strong. She was fighting it.
It's extremely rare to survive a gunshot wound to the head, but 2 gunshots, that's practically unheard of.
However, the joy over Katrina's miraculous recovery is marred by the ongoing investigation into her daughter's disappearance.
Did Tim say anything to you about Anastasia?
About Star? No, why?
To go through an ordeal like that, only to pull through and to realize that your child is missing, that had to be a devastating blow.
We know that you've been through a lot already.
We're going to find her.
Armed with Katrina's statement, the investigators are ready to make their move on Tim Crumedy.
They have all the evidence they need to arrest Tim. Police take Tim into custody that Sunday.
Police charged him with first-degree murder and also assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder.
Tim's congregation is stunned.
When you're a pastor, people trust you. The congregation trusts you. They believe in you. They believe that you're giving the word of God. And to have this happen, you know, the public was actually so shocked at all of it.
But where is Katrina's youngest daughter, Star?
Investigators really believed he knew where Star was.
They feel like they are at Tim's mercy to get the information they need about her disappearance.
After surviving the brutal attack that claimed her fiancé's life, Katrina Paul has told detectives that the man responsible for pulling the trigger is her ex-boyfriend, Tim Crumedy.
I just thought it was a miracle that she survived. It's proof that not only is God watching over us, but he's not done with her yet.
Now, North Carolina police have taken Tim into custody and are trying to get a confession out of him, as well as the whereabouts of Katrina's missing daughter, Star.
Where is she, Tim?
Unfortunately, Tim isn't forthcoming.
I have nothing to say to you. I want an attorney.
Tim refused to admit to anything.
While Tim is booked into jail to await trial, the investigators continue their efforts to find Star.
The detectives did their best. They tried, but no one could find her.
I never accepted that she was gone, not for a second. I still had hope that my sister was somewhere.
But as more time passes, that hope becomes harder to hold on to.
It was months, and then it was years. And as Tim's trial approached, they still didn't have any answers about what happened to Anastasia.
I was angry. I was very angry.
I just felt so sorrowful for the family, the suffering they went through. I don't know how they deal with that burden.
Despite their pain, Katrina's family is standing strong by their mother's side when Tim's trial gets underway in February 2018.
When prosecutors make their opening statements, they contend that this crime was about one thing: control.
Timothy was a controlling man. He was a very controlling man.
When Katrina broke up with him and started dating Michael, prosecutors said that lit a flame of jealousy in his heart.
The thought of being rejected, it pushed him over the edge.
According to the prosecution, the events that played out on the night of August 5th, 2016, were the direct result of Tim's unbridled jealousy and rage.
Tim executed his romantic rival in cold blood and attempted to do the same to his ex-girlfriend. But by sheer luck, she managed to survive.
Among the prosecution's first witnesses was the first officer on the scene, who testified that he saw someone in a green t-shirt running away on the night in question. In court, he identified Tim Cremity as that person he saw running away.
Investigators thought he may have grabbed a towel from Katrina's apartment to wipe his fingerprints from the crime scene.
But the prosecution's most powerful witness by far is Katrina Paul herself.
Before Katrina took the stand, they played her audio from her 911 call, and it just sent a chill through the entire courtroom.
He stopped me. He stopped me.
I heard my mom on that 911 call, and I just lost it.
To have that played in a courtroom and broadcast everywhere, that is one brave woman.
Brave enough to take the stand and confront the man who shot her face to face.
It was the first time that she had seen Tim since that night, and he stared at her coldly as she testified.
Katrina was able to describe her incredible story of survival to the jury about getting kidnapped by her ex, shot in the head not once but twice, and escaping from the trunk of the car to get help. It's nothing short of a miracle that she survived to tell them what happened to her.
When the jury retires to deliberate, they take 2 full days to weigh the evidence.
In the end, they found Tim guilty of first-degree murder of Michael Gretzinger, as well as the kidnapping and attempted murder of Katrina Paul.
Tim Cremity is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The public was so shocked at all of it. Shocked that a man who professed to be the representative of God would do this.
For Katrina Paul and her loved ones, it's gratifying to see Tim sent away for life. But no punishment can make up for what he did to them.
I don't feel like justice has been served, only because he's still here.
I thought it was too lenient. I thought if there's ever a time where capital punishment should be in play, I thought this was one of those times.
And even after Tim is sentenced for his attack on Michael and Katrina, her family still doesn't have answers on Anastasia's whereabouts.
Everyone believed Tim had something to do with her disappearance, but he wouldn't talk.
Another year goes by without any new developments in the case. But on January 15th, 2019, deputies with the Iredell County Sheriff's Office just outside Charlotte receive a chilling 911 call.
Somebody was going to look at some land in Mooresville, and he came across some remains.
They found 70 human bones strewn about a wooded area behind a grocery store.
That evidence was sent eventually to North Carolina State Forensic Team.
It was Anastasia Meters.
For Anastasia's family, it's bittersweet news.
When I found out that it was my sister, I just broke down. We didn't have to look no further. We knew that she was on her journey to heaven.
After that, I just felt cold. I just felt like, I felt a lot of anger.
I'm an older sister, and looking at I would have traded tastes with her.
Although the motive for Starr's murder is still unclear, her family believes it was just another way Tim tried to get back at Katrina for leaving him.
Tim is still the main suspect in Anastasia's.
For nearly 2 decades, somewhere in America, an ordinary day could end with the sound of tearing paper. A package would arrive without warning. A plain brown box. A carefully wrapped parcel. A gift that no one remembered ordering. There would be no masked stranger waiting outside the door, no threatening phone call, no dramatic chase through dark streets. There would only be curiosity, a hand reaching for a string, fingers sliding beneath folded cardboard. The quiet confidence that whatever was inside belonged to the person opening it. Then, in less than a heartbeat, that confidence would disappear forever. The explosion was never the beginning. It was the end of a journey that had started days, sometimes weeks, before the package ever reached its destination. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man had measured every piece of metal with impossible patience. He had carved wooden components by hand, filed away rough edges, tested springs, folded wires, disguised mechanisms beneath ordinary objects, and packed every part with the precision of someone solving a mathematical proof instead of preparing an act of murder. Nothing about his work suggested panic. Nothing suggested rage. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, almost peaceful. That was perhaps the most terrifying part. Violence is often imagined as something impulsive. A burst of anger. A sudden decision. A moment when emotions overwhelm reason. But this killer believed reason itself demanded violence. He was not running from society. He believed he was trying to save it. Long before investigators gave him a nickname, before newspapers turned him into front-page headlines, before television anchors struggled to explain the growing list of victims, he had already become something else entirely. He had become a ghost moving through the American postal system. Invisible. Patient. Untouchable. Every bomb carried the same silent signature. Not fingerprints. Not DNA. Not handwriting that could be easily traced. Instead, it carried a philosophy. Each device seemed to ask the same disturbing question. What if the greatest threat to humanity was not a criminal hiding in the woods, but the modern world itself? No one knew who was asking that question. No one knew where he lived. No one knew what face belonged to the mind behind the explosions. They only knew that somewhere, someone was watching. Every successful attack meant another period of silence. Weeks would pass. Months would pass. Investigators would begin convincing themselves that perhaps the nightmare had ended. Then another package would appear. Another explosion. Another life changed forever. The pattern repeated so many times that hope itself became dangerous. Every quiet season carried the possibility that another bomb was already moving through the mail, crossing state lines inside delivery trucks and airplanes, resting unnoticed among thousands of harmless packages. The victims seemed connected only by fragments. A professor. A graduate student. A computer store owner. An airline executive. An advertising executive. Scientists. Engineers. People whose careers represented innovation, technology, education, or progress. There was no personal revenge. No robbery. No ransom. No demand for money. The attacks ignored nearly every rule investigators relied upon to understand violent criminals. Detectives searched for relationships between victims and found almost none. Behavioral experts studied timelines until the pages became covered with notes and arrows pointing nowhere. Laboratories examined bomb fragments so carefully that individual splinters of wood were catalogued like priceless museum artifacts. Yet every answer seemed to produce two new questions. The bombs themselves were unlike anything agents had encountered before. Each one looked as though it had been built by someone who possessed extraordinary intelligence and endless patience. The craftsmanship was remarkable in the most horrifying sense. Pieces that should never have fit together somehow formed deadly machines capable of surviving transportation without accidental detonation. Ordinary household materials became lethal through creativity rather than expensive equipment. Every recovered fragment suggested the builder understood not only mechanics but psychology. He knew exactly how people behaved when they opened packages. He anticipated curiosity. He relied upon trust. America had faced serial killers before. It had faced hijackers, bombers, hostage-takers, and organized crime. But this felt different. This enemy had no visible face. He crossed state borders without leaving footprints. He communicated only through destruction. The public imagined someone hiding inside crowded cities, blending into commuters and office workers. Others pictured a radical living with underground political groups. Some believed the bomber had military training. Others suspected foreign intelligence agencies. The theories multiplied because there was almost nothing solid to hold on to. The uncertainty spread faster than the fear itself. University mailrooms developed new routines. Office workers hesitated before opening unexpected deliveries. Secretaries examined unfamiliar packages a little longer than before. Postal employees found themselves wondering whether an ordinary parcel felt slightly heavier than it should. Families asked loved ones to be careful around suspicious mail. Caution slowly became habit. Meanwhile, the man responsible remained astonishingly calm. He did not seek television interviews. He did not boast to friends. He did not leave dramatic messages at crime scenes. Instead, he disappeared into silence after every attack, allowing investigators to exhaust themselves chasing shadows while he returned to an isolated routine that appeared almost unimaginably ordinary. Some killers crave recognition immediately. He preferred invisibility. The absence of attention was not a weakness in his plan. It was the plan. That patience transformed him into one of the most expensive and frustrating investigations in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thousands of leads arrived from every corner of the country. Innocent people became temporary suspects because of vague similarities. Tips flooded into offices after every news broadcast. Agents traveled across states pursuing possibilities that dissolved within days. Every failure strengthened the illusion that the bomber might never be found. Years became decades. Children who had been born after the first explosion entered high school before the investigation reached its conclusion. Think about what that means. An entire generation grew up while one unidentified man quietly continued his campaign against modern society. He adapted. Investigators adapted. Technology advanced. Forensic science improved. Yet somehow he remained ahead. Every unsuccessful attack taught him something. Every successful one convinced him his methods worked. Behind the headlines, another story unfolded quietly. Families learned to live with permanent injuries. Survivors reconstructed lives around damaged hands, damaged hearing, damaged eyesight, and memories that could never be erased. A simple trip to collect the mail could become an emotional challenge. The sound of cardboard tearing, once meaningless, now carried echoes of unimaginable pain. Recovery was measured not only through surgeries and rehabilitation but through learning to trust ordinary life again. Those stories rarely occupied newspaper front pages for long. The mystery of the bomber always overshadowed the people he had harmed. That imbalance would follow the case for years. The unknown criminal became a legend. The victims became statistics. Yet behind every number stood a family forced to answer impossible questions. Why this person? Why this package? Why us? The answers never came from the bomber. At least, not in the way anyone expected. Because eventually, after years of silence, the invisible man would decide that explosions alone were no longer enough. He wanted the world to understand him. Or perhaps more accurately, he wanted the world to understand the version of reality he had spent years constructing inside his own mind. He believed history would judge him differently than the courts ever could. He believed that if people read his words carefully enough, they might begin questioning the very civilization he had spent years attacking. It was a breathtaking assumption. Not because it reflected confidence. Because it revealed something far more dangerous. He no longer saw himself merely as the author of violence. He saw himself as the author of an idea. And ideas, unlike bombs, could travel much farther than the mail ever could. He believed ideas could outlive every explosion. That belief made him different from almost every notorious criminal America had ever pursued. Most serial offenders devoted enormous energy to hiding what they had done. They erased evidence, destroyed weapons, created false alibis, and hoped investigators would never discover their names. This man wanted something else entirely. He wanted anonymity only until the moment he believed the world was finally ready to listen. For years, investigators searched for fingerprints. They should have been searching for a worldview. Somewhere beyond the crime scenes, beyond the forensic reports and evidence lockers, a philosophy had been growing in complete isolation. It was not written overnight. It was built slowly, layer by layer, through years of resentment, intellectual certainty, and profound separation from ordinary human life. Every bomb was another paragraph. Every victim became another sentence. Every explosion was another attempt to force society into a conversation it had never agreed to have. But the conversation always began the same way. With blood. That contradiction sat at the heart of the entire case. The man responsible claimed to care about humanity while choosing methods that shattered innocent lives. He spoke of freedom while deciding that strangers no longer deserved the freedom to live safely. He condemned systems of control while placing absolute control over the lives of people he had never met. His logic was carefully constructed, but its foundation rested on violence that no argument could justify. The public did not know any of this. To millions of Americans, the Unabomber existed only as fragments of information appearing between commercials on the evening news. A blurry police sketch. Grainy photographs of damaged buildings. Yellow crime scene tape stretching across sidewalks. Investigators carrying boxes of evidence into government vehicles. News anchors repeating the same unanswered questions. Who is he? Where is he? Who will be next? As the years passed, those questions became part of the country's collective memory. Parents reminded children never to touch unexpected packages. University administrators issued safety notices. Businesses developed procedures for suspicious deliveries. Mailrooms became places of quiet caution rather than routine convenience. An object designed to connect people, a package sent through the mail, had been transformed into something capable of inspiring fear before it was even opened. That kind of fear is difficult to measure. It doesn't appear in casualty reports. It cannot be photographed. It spreads through hesitation. Through silence. Through the extra second someone spends staring at an unfamiliar box resting on a desk. Across the country, thousands of ordinary packages continued reaching their destinations every single day without incident. Birthdays were celebrated. Holiday gifts arrived on time. Business contracts crossed state lines. Families mailed photographs to relatives. Life continued almost exactly as it always had. And that normality became the perfect disguise. Because statistically, no one expected danger. The bomber understood probability. He understood that people trusted routine more than instinct. He depended upon that trust every single time he mailed another device. Some killers stalk their victims through dark streets. He allowed the postal service to do the traveling for him. The distances involved only deepened the mystery. One explosion might occur on the West Coast. Another would strike somewhere in the Midwest. Years later, another bomb would detonate hundreds of miles away from both. There seemed to be no obvious geographical center, no predictable pattern that could narrow the search. Every new crime expanded the map rather than shrinking it. Investigators assembled mountains of evidence. Tiny screws. Bent nails. Fragments of copper wire. Pieces of homemade circuitry. Splinters from carefully carved wooden boxes. Minute chemical traces. Each recovered fragment represented another opportunity to identify the builder. Yet each laboratory report ended almost the same way. Interesting. Highly unusual. Not enough. The devices displayed remarkable consistency without revealing the identity of their creator. Certain construction techniques appeared again and again. Specific choices suggested habits that had developed over many years. Experts concluded they were hunting one individual rather than several copycats. That realization simplified one mystery while creating another. If one man had truly committed every attack, then he possessed extraordinary discipline. He knew when to disappear. He knew when to wait. He understood patience better than many investigators understood urgency. Time itself had become one of his weapons. Every month without an arrest weakened public confidence. Every failed lead increased pressure on federal agencies. Every attack reminded the country that somewhere, An unknown man remained free. The investigation consumed resources on a scale rarely seen in domestic criminal cases. Analysts filled conference rooms with timelines stretching across walls. Detectives compared witness statements that often contradicted one another. Behavioral profilers debated personality traits, education levels, likely occupations, and possible psychological disorders. Teams examined political extremists, former military personnel, university faculty, engineers, anti-technology activists, and countless others who seemed plausible for a few days before evidence eliminated them. No profile seemed complete. Some experts imagined an aging blue-collar mechanic. Others envisioned a highly educated academic. Some believed the bomber lived in a city. Others argued he must reside deep in rural isolation. Every theory contained pieces that fit beautifully. Every theory also left uncomfortable gaps. The bomber himself remained frustratingly absent from every prediction. There was another reason this investigation proved so difficult. The man behind the bombs did not appear driven by ordinary criminal motivations. Money left obvious trails. Jealousy pointed toward personal relationships. Organized crime followed financial interests. Political terrorism often involved groups demanding public concessions. But this campaign belonged to someone operating almost entirely alone. There were no accomplices stepping forward. No intercepted communications. No hidden organization claiming responsibility. Just one invisible craftsman producing sophisticated explosive devices over and over again with almost impossible consistency. That level of isolation fascinated criminal psychologists. Human beings rarely remain completely disconnected from others for extended periods. They argue. They boast. They make mistakes. They reveal secrets during moments of weakness. Even carefully planned conspiracies eventually fracture under pressure. This case refused to follow those expectations. The silence surrounding the bomber became almost supernatural. Friends did not recognize him. Neighbors did not suspect him. Co-workers never reported strange behavior because, as far as anyone knew, there might not even be co-workers. He existed only through evidence left behind after explosions. Nothing else. It is tempting, looking backward with the benefit of history, to imagine that the clues were obvious from the beginning. To believe that one overlooked detail could have solved everything years earlier. But investigations do not unfold with perfect clarity. They unfold through uncertainty, incomplete information, and decisions made under enormous pressure. What appears inevitable in hindsight often looked impossible in the present. The agents chasing this case understood one painful truth. Every day without an arrest meant another day in which another package might already be moving through the postal system. Another family might unknowingly carry it into their home. Another office assistant might set it gently on a manager's desk. Another professor might smile at what appeared to be an unexpected delivery. And somewhere, perhaps hundreds of miles away, the man responsible would continue living an ordinary day, reading books, writing notes, gathering materials, waiting for the next moment he believed would serve his cause. That contrast is difficult to comprehend. One life unfolding in quiet isolation. Many others forever altered by decisions made inside that isolation. The distance between those worlds was measured not in miles, but in intent. One side trusted. The other planned. One side opened a package. The other had already imagined exactly how that moment would end. For 17 years, that invisible connection held. It linked strangers who would never meet. Victims who had never heard one another's names. Investigators separated by thousands of miles. And at the center of it all stood a man who believed he was not writing the story of a criminal, but the opening chapter of a revolution. He could not have known that the very thing he valued most, his own words, would eventually become the thread that unraveled everything. Long before agents discovered the small cabin hidden among the forests of Montana, before evidence boxes filled with handwritten journals, before one of the largest manhunts in FBI history finally reached its conclusion, there was only a question hanging over America like an approaching storm. How do you find a man who has spent nearly 20 years making sure no one knows who he is? The answer would emerge from a place no explosive device could ever control. Not from the twisted metal left behind after another blast. Not from shattered windows or scorched wooden fragments. But from language itself. From sentences. From habits of thought. From the unmistakable fingerprints that a human mind leaves behind every time it tries to explain the world. Language has a strange way of revealing what people spend their entire lives trying to conceal. A person can change their appearance. They can move across the country, live under another name, grow a beard, shave their head, abandon old friends, and disappear into places where no one thinks to look. But thoughts are far more stubborn. They settle into familiar rhythms. They return to the same words, the same arguments, the same unusual turns of phrase. Every sentence carries traces of the person who wrote it, whether they intend it or not. The man the world would come to know as the Unabomber understood explosives with extraordinary precision. He underestimated language. That mistake would eventually bring an end to one of the longest and most expensive criminal investigations in American history. But none of the people living through those years could see that ending. They lived without certainty, without closure, without knowing whether the next victim had already been chosen. Looking back now, it is easy to remember the headlines, the courtroom photographs, and the image of a bearded man standing beside a weathered wooden cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. Those images have become part of modern criminal history. They feel almost inevitable, as though every event had been moving toward that conclusion from the very beginning. History often creates that illusion. Reality never does. Reality is messier. It is built from thousands of decisions made without knowing whether they are right. An investigator deciding which lead deserves another week of work. A forensic analyst staring at microscopic fragments that refuse to reveal their secrets. A journalist trying to separate fact from rumor before another edition goes to print. A family wondering whether someone they love could somehow be connected to the terrifying stories filling television screens. And somewhere beyond all of them, hidden behind mountains, forests, and silence, one man convinced himself that every explosion proved he was being heard. He measured success differently from everyone else. Police measured success by arrests. Doctors measured it by survivors. Families measured it by the empty chairs that remained occupied only by memory. The bomber measured success by attention. Every newspaper article. Every televised press conference. Every debate about technology. Every frightened conversation in a university hallway. To him, fear was evidence that his message was spreading. That is one of the most disturbing truths about this case. The bombs were never meant to exist on their own. They were designed to force an audience. Without attention, they would have been nothing more than isolated crimes. With attention, they became something much larger. A national obsession. An investigation that stretched across nearly 2 decades. A mystery that challenged some of the most experienced investigators in the country. And ultimately, a cautionary tale about what can happen when extraordinary intelligence becomes untethered from empathy. Because this story is not simply about bombs. It is not simply about one brilliant man living alone in the wilderness. It is not even simply about the pursuit that finally brought him into custody. At its heart, this is a story about isolation. About ideas left unchallenged for so long that they harden into certainty. About a mind capable of solving complex mathematical problems while simultaneously convincing itself that innocent strangers could become acceptable sacrifices. It is also a story about resilience. About investigators who refused to abandon a case that seemed impossible. About survivors who rebuilt lives forever divided into a before and an after. About families who endured years of unanswered questions before justice finally arrived. Those are the stories that often disappear beneath the legend. The myth of the mysterious bomber is compelling. The reality was devastating. Every explosion left behind more than physical destruction. It left birthdays celebrated with someone missing. Careers interrupted in a single violent instant. Parents comforting frightened children without having answers themselves. Colleagues struggling to understand why an ordinary workday had turned into tragedy. No philosophy could erase those consequences. No manifesto could undo them. No argument about technology or civilization could restore what had been taken. That is why this story deserves to be told carefully. Not because it glorifies a criminal, but because it reminds us how easily intelligence can become dangerous when it loses sight of human life. Over the next chapters, we will travel backward through the years, long before the manhunt reached its dramatic conclusion. We will step inside classrooms where remarkable talent first became visible, examine the quiet roads that led toward isolation, and meet the people whose lives intersected with a campaign of violence they never saw coming. We will follow investigators as promising leads collapse, witness breakthroughs that almost happened years too early, and uncover the chain of decisions that finally transformed an invisible ghost into a man standing in handcuffs. Some moments will feel almost impossible to believe. Others will be painfully ordinary. That contrast is precisely what makes this case endure. Evil does not always arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it arrives inside an ordinary parcel resting quietly on a doorstep. Sometimes it hides inside ideas repeated often enough that their contradictions begin to disappear. And sometimes, the longest journey toward justice begins not with an explosion, but with a single sentence that finally sounds familiar to the right person. This is the story of Theodore John Kaczynski. The story of the man the world called the Unabomber. And the 17-year hunt that forced an entire nation to ask how someone could vanish into plain sight while leaving destruction scattered across America, one carefully constructed package at a time. There was a time when no one looked at Theodore John Kaczynski and imagined a future filled with bomb squads, federal investigations, and one of the longest manhunts in American history. Before the headlines, before the sketches taped to post office walls, before the name Unabomber became synonymous with fear, there was simply a quiet little boy growing up in a modest neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. The house where Ted spent his childhood looked much like countless others built in the years following the Great Depression. Small front lawns stretched toward sidewalks where children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on in the evening. Neighbors recognized one another by name. Doors were left unlocked more often than not. Families believed that education, hard work, and discipline could build a better future than the one their parents had known. Ted's parents believed that with every part of themselves. His father, Theodore Richard Kaczynski, worked long hours in a factory. His mother, Wanda, devoted herself to raising her children with structure and expectation. Neither came from privilege. Both understood sacrifice. They dreamed of giving their sons opportunities that had never existed for their own generation. To anyone passing by, the Kaczynski family appeared ordinary. They attended church. They valued education. They lived carefully, spending only what they could afford. Nothing about their daily routine hinted that history would one day remember their family for reasons no parent could ever imagine. Ted was born on May 22, 1942, during the uncertainty of the Second World War. America itself was changing rapidly. Factories expanded. Scientific innovation accelerated. New technologies promised a future brighter than anything previous generations had experienced. Across the country, optimism slowly replaced the hardship of the Depression. It was an age that celebrated progress. Ironically, the child born into that atmosphere would later spend his life declaring war against the very idea of technological progress. No one could have predicted that contradiction. As a young child, Ted rarely demanded attention. He preferred quiet corners over noisy playgrounds. While other children chased baseballs across empty lots or argued over neighborhood games, Ted often disappeared into books. Reading seemed to offer something that ordinary conversations could not. Stories followed logical structures. Mathematics offered certainty. Numbers behaved predictably. Human beings did not. Teachers noticed his intelligence almost immediately. Not simply because he earned high marks, but because he grasped concepts that seemed well beyond his age. Problems that challenged other students often appeared almost effortless to him. He completed assignments quickly, sometimes sitting silently while classmates continued working for another 20 minutes. Adults praised him for being gifted. Gifted children often receive admiration. They also receive expectations. Those expectations can become surprisingly heavy for someone still learning how to understand the world. Ted's academic abilities soon separated him from classmates in ways no report card could fully measure. School administrators concluded that he needed greater intellectual challenges. The solution seemed obvious. Advance him. He skipped grades. On paper, it was a remarkable achievement. In practice, it quietly altered the course of his childhood. Imagine being surrounded every day by classmates 2 or even 3 years older. Conversations revolved around experiences you had not yet reached. Friendships formed through shared stages of development that no amount of intelligence could replace. A child may solve advanced mathematical equations and still struggle to understand playground politics. Ted found himself increasingly alone. He did not become isolated overnight. Isolation arrived gradually, almost politely. A lunch eaten in silence. A classroom discussion where everyone else laughed at jokes he did not understand. Birthday parties that never became close friendships. The distance between him and other children widened so slowly that few adults recognized it while it was happening. Academic success continued masking emotional separation. Report cards celebrated excellence. No report card measured loneliness. His parents remained deeply proud of his accomplishments. Their son's extraordinary mind appeared to confirm every sacrifice they had made. Teachers encouraged higher goals. Relatives spoke about his future with admiration. College seemed inevitable long before most children his age had begun imagining adulthood. Yet remarkable intelligence often creates unusual pressures. When a child repeatedly hears words like genius, exceptional, or extraordinary, failure begins to feel dangerous. Expectations become part of personal identity. Mistakes no longer seem temporary. They become threats to the image everyone else believes. Whether Ted experienced those emotions directly is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that he increasingly retreated inward. Books replaced conversations. Ideas became more comfortable than people. The world inside his mind grew richer while the world around him seemed more difficult to navigate. There was another event from his early childhood that has often been discussed by psychologists and biographers. When Ted was still an infant, he became seriously ill with an allergic reaction and spent time hospitalized away from his parents. Family members later remembered a noticeable change after he returned home. They described him as more withdrawn and less emotionally responsive than before. Some writers have suggested this separation played an important role in shaping his personality. Others caution against drawing direct conclusions. Modern psychological research does not support the idea that a single event can explain the development of someone who later commits serious crimes. Human behavior is shaped by many interacting influences over time, and no single childhood experience can adequately account for what Ted Kaczynski would eventually do. What remains undeniable is that those who knew him often remembered him as emotionally distant. Not cruel. Not violent. Simply difficult to reach. Even family members sometimes struggled to understand what he was thinking. His younger brother, David, experienced childhood differently. More socially comfortable, David often acted as a bridge between Ted and the outside world. The brothers spent time together, explored nearby parks, and shared moments that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Yet even within the family, Ted seemed to exist behind an invisible wall. He cared deeply about certain subjects. He displayed curiosity about nature. He enjoyed exploring wooded areas whenever opportunities arose. Away from crowded classrooms and neighborhood streets, he appeared calmer. Trees did not ask awkward questions. Rivers did not judge silence. Forests demanded nothing except observation. Years later, those preferences would take on symbolic significance. At the time, they simply looked like hobbies. Chicago itself was changing rapidly during Ted's youth. New highways stretched across neighborhoods. Factories expanded. Suburban developments replaced open land. America celebrated engineering achievements as signs of national strength. The space race captured imaginations. Scientific breakthroughs promised solutions to problems that had challenged humanity for centuries. Adults looked toward the future with excitement. Ted seemed to look at it with increasing skepticism. Not openly. Not yet. Those doubts would not fully emerge for many years. But the seeds of a different worldview may already have been quietly taking root. His fascination with mathematics deepened throughout adolescence. Unlike literature or history, mathematics seemed untouched by opinion. A proof was either correct or incorrect. There were no political debates inside an equation. No social expectations. No emotional negotiations. For someone uncomfortable navigating human relationships, mathematics offered extraordinary comfort. It rewarded logic. It ignored popularity. It cared nothing for appearance or charm. Every correct solution felt earned rather than negotiated. Teachers increasingly recognized that they were teaching someone operating at an unusually high intellectual level. Recommendations followed. Scholarships became realistic possibilities. Conversations shifted from whether Ted would attend college to which prestigious university would eventually compete for him. Success appeared inevitable. From the outside, the story looked almost inspirational. A hard-working family. A brilliant student. A future limited only by imagination. Few stories begin with obvious warnings. The most unsettling chapters often grow quietly beneath achievements that everyone else celebrates. Because while the adults around Ted saw remarkable intelligence preparing for extraordinary success, almost no one stopped to ask a different question. Who was he becoming when no one was watching? By the time Ted Kaczynski reached his mid-teens, the word prodigy followed him almost everywhere he went. Teachers spoke about him with admiration reserved for the rare student who appeared only once in an entire career. Classmates knew he was brilliant long before they knew anything else about him. Intelligence had become his identity, the first characteristic people noticed and often the only one they remembered. But admiration is not the same as belonging. While adults celebrated his academic achievements, Ted continued moving through adolescence as someone who never seemed entirely comfortable inside the ordinary rhythm of teenage life. Hallways echoed with conversations about sports, dances, first relationships, and weekend plans. Groups formed naturally between classes, laughter spilling into crowded corridors before the next bell interrupted the noise. Ted was usually somewhere nearby. Rarely at the center. Sometimes not part of those conversations at all. He was not the kind of student who demanded attention by acting out. He did not become known for fighting or breaking rules. Instead, he drifted toward the edges of social life, where observation replaced participation. Those who remembered him years later often described someone who appeared polite, intelligent, and intensely private. He answered questions when asked. He completed assignments with astonishing accuracy. Then he quietly returned to his own thoughts. The distance between academic success and emotional connection grew wider with each passing year. It is important to understand that many exceptionally gifted children experience some degree of social isolation without ever becoming violent. High intelligence does not predict criminal behavior, nor does introversion. Millions of people who feel different from their peers go on to live compassionate and productive lives. Ted Kaczynski's later crimes cannot be explained simply by the fact that he was intelligent or lonely. His path would be shaped by a far more complex combination of personal choices, beliefs, experiences, and circumstances. Still, those early years reveal a pattern that would continue throughout much of his life. He trusted ideas more than people. He found structure more comforting than conversation. And whenever human relationships became confusing, he often retreated into intellectual pursuits where the rules never changed. In 1958, at only 16 years old, Ted entered Harvard University. For most students, arriving at Harvard represented the beginning of adulthood. For Ted, it also meant entering an environment where nearly everyone around him had been the brightest student in their own hometown. Suddenly, extraordinary intelligence was no longer unusual. It was expected. The campus itself carried an atmosphere unlike anywhere Ted had experienced before. Ancient brick buildings stood beneath towering trees whose branches had shaded generations of scholars. Narrow walkways connected libraries filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Lecture halls buzzed with conversations about mathematics, philosophy, physics, literature, politics, and science. Students arrived believing they would help shape the future of the country. For many, the experience was exhilarating. For Ted, it appears to have been far more complicated. He was still only 16. Many classmates were several years older, emotionally more mature, and already accustomed to living away from home. While they explored new friendships and the excitement of university life, Ted entered that world carrying years of social uncertainty. His remarkable intellect had earned him a place among America's brightest young minds, but intellectual achievement could not erase the realities of adolescence. Living in the dormitories exposed him to an entirely different social environment. Conversations continued late into the night. Students debated politics over meals, attended gatherings, built friendships, and experimented with the freedoms that came with leaving home. Ted rarely became part of that culture. Instead, he immersed himself in mathematics, where problems could still be solved through logic rather than emotional intuition. The university challenged him in new ways. Courses demanded greater creativity. Professors expected original thinking instead of memorized answers. Competition surrounded him. Yet even in that demanding environment, Ted demonstrated extraordinary mathematical ability. Faculty members recognized that they were teaching someone capable of abstract reasoning at an exceptional level. From the outside, his future seemed increasingly clear. Graduate school. Academic research. Perhaps a distinguished career as a mathematician. No one imagined that decades later, newspapers would remember Harvard not as the place where a brilliant young scholar flourished, but as one chapter in the life of the man who became the Unabomber. During Ted's years at Harvard, another element entered his story that would later attract significant public attention. He participated in a series of psychological studies conducted by Professor Henry Murray. These experiments exposed participants to highly stressful interviews in which their personal beliefs and values were aggressively challenged and criticized while their reactions were recorded. In the years following Ted's arrest, many commentators speculated that these experiments might have transformed him into the person he later became. That claim, however, goes beyond what the evidence supports. Researchers who have studied the case generally agree that there is no reliable evidence showing the experiments caused Ted Kaczynski's later acts of violence. While some participants described the experience as deeply unpleasant, thousands of people have undergone stressful psychological research without committing crimes. The experiments remain controversial, but they cannot reasonably explain a bombing campaign that began nearly 2 decades later. History often seeks simple explanations for complex tragedies. This case refuses to offer one. There was no single switch that suddenly changed Ted from a gifted student into a future domestic terrorist. Instead, the available evidence suggests a gradual evolution of ideas, personality, and choices unfolding across many years. Outside the classroom, Ted's isolation appeared to deepen. Letters and recollections from people who knew him suggest someone increasingly disconnected from ordinary social experiences. Romantic relationships remained elusive. Close friendships were limited. Conversations often centered on intellectual topics rather than emotional ones. Some classmates remembered him as intensely serious. Others barely remembered him at all. He could spend hours immersed in mathematical problems that seemed almost impossible to everyone else. Complex proofs fascinated him. Abstract structures held his attention for entire evenings. There was elegance in mathematics that he rarely seemed to find elsewhere. Yet even mathematics could not answer the larger questions beginning to occupy his thoughts. What gives life meaning? What happens when society changes faster than people can adapt? Does technological progress always improve human existence? At Harvard, those questions existed mostly in the background. They had not yet become obsessions. The America surrounding the university was changing rapidly. The Cold War shaped politics. Scientific achievements accelerated at an extraordinary pace. Computers, still enormous machines occupying entire rooms, hinted at possibilities that few people fully understood. Space exploration captured national imagination. Universities celebrated innovation as the engine of the future. TED observed that future from within one of its most prestigious institutions. Ironically, the place dedicated to advancing knowledge would eventually educate a man who came to reject much of the civilization that celebrated it. When he graduated from Harvard in 1962 with a degree in mathematics, his academic record remained exceptional. Doors opened effortlessly. Prestigious graduate programs competed for talented students like him. The next step led west, toward the University of Michigan, where his mathematical abilities would reach even greater heights. From the outside, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as his parents had dreamed years earlier in their modest Chicago home. Their brilliant son had earned a place among America's intellectual elite. He possessed opportunities most people could scarcely imagine. Success seemed not only possible, but almost guaranteed. Yet beneath the achievements, another story continued unfolding quietly. The loneliness had not disappeared. It had simply matured alongside his intellect. And while professors admired the precision of his mathematical thinking, almost no one recognized that another system of ideas, far less rigorous, far more dangerous, was slowly beginning to take shape beyond the blackboards and lecture halls where his extraordinary mind had first earned its reputation. The University of Michigan became the place where Ted Kaczynski's academic brilliance reached its highest point. If Harvard had confirmed that he belonged among the nation's brightest students, Michigan proved that he could compete with some of the finest mathematical minds of his generation. Graduate-level mathematics demanded a different kind of thinking. The problems were no longer exercises with predictable solutions. They required imagination, patience, and the ability to navigate ideas so abstract that even experienced scholars sometimes struggled to explain them in ordinary language. Ted excelled. Professors praised the originality of his work. Fellow graduate students recognized that they were studying alongside someone whose ability bordered on extraordinary. His doctoral dissertation in mathematics earned exceptional evaluations, and those familiar with the field later described it as technically sophisticated. Years of discipline had produced exactly the future everyone expected. By his mid-20s, Ted possessed credentials that many academics spend an entire lifetime pursuing. The next opportunity arrived quickly. In 1967, at just 25 years old, he accepted a position as an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley. At the time, Berkeley stood at the center of enormous cultural and political change. The campus was famous not only for academic excellence but also for student activism, protests against the Vietnam War, and debates that challenged traditional ideas about authority, freedom, and the future of American society. The contrast could not have been greater. Outside lecture halls, thousands of students argued passionately about politics and social change. Inside classrooms, Ted focused almost entirely on mathematics. He was, by most accounts, a capable instructor and an exceptionally gifted researcher. Students remembered him as intelligent, though often reserved and emotionally distant. He lectured with precision rather than enthusiasm. Mathematics interested him far more than small talk, and personal relationships remained limited. Then, something happened that surprised nearly everyone around him. After less than 2 years at Berkeley, Ted resigned. There was no dramatic public explanation. No scandal. No obvious professional failure. He simply walked away from one of the most promising academic careers a young mathematician could hope for. To colleagues, the decision seemed baffling. Years of extraordinary achievement had culminated in a prestigious university appointment, only for Ted to abandon it almost as quickly as he had earned it. Looking back, that resignation marked a turning point. It was the moment his life began moving away from conventional success and toward increasing isolation. After leaving Berkeley, Ted drifted through a period of uncertainty. He returned briefly to Illinois, lived with family for a time, and struggled to find satisfaction in ordinary employment. The academic world that had once seemed destined to become his lifelong home no longer held the same appeal. Increasingly, He became convinced that modern civilization itself was the problem. These beliefs did not emerge fully formed overnight. They developed gradually over years, shaped by his reading, personal experiences, and philosophical reflections. He grew deeply skeptical of industrialization, technological expansion, and what he viewed as the growing loss of individual autonomy in modern society. Many people criticize technology or industrial development without endorsing violence. Ted's path diverged because he eventually concluded that violent action was justified. That conclusion was his own. It was neither inevitable nor supported by the evidence available to him. In 1971, seeking a life far removed from cities and universities, Ted purchased a small parcel of land outside Lincoln, Montana. The cabin he built there would later become one of the most recognizable locations in modern criminal history. Yet when it was first constructed, it looked almost insignificant. The structure measured only about 10 by 12 feet. There was no electricity, no running water, no telephone, no plumbing. Heat came from a simple wood stove. Water had to be carried. Food required careful planning. Winters demanded endurance. Surrounded by forests and mountains, the cabin reflected Ted's determination to live as independently as possible from the industrial society he increasingly rejected. To him, this was freedom. He hunted. He gathered edible plants. He read extensively. He wrote journals filled with observations and increasingly rigid philosophical arguments. He spent long periods almost entirely alone. Silence became his constant companion. Visitors were rare. Days passed according to rhythms set by weather rather than clocks. Morning light filtered through towering pine trees. Snow settled across the landscape in winter until the world seemed wrapped in white silence. Summers brought long hours beneath clear skies where the only sounds came from wind moving through branches and distant wildlife. For many people, such isolation would have felt unbearable. For Ted, it appeared to offer exactly what he believed civilization had taken away. But isolation carries its own risks. When ideas are never challenged by meaningful conversation, they can become increasingly absolute. Doubts have fewer opportunities to grow. Contradictions become easier to ignore. A person may begin believing that every conclusion reached in solitude must therefore be correct. Over time, Ted's writings reveal an increasingly uncompromising worldview. He argued that technological progress inevitably reduced human freedom and that modern industrial society produced widespread psychological suffering. Some of these concerns echoed debates found within environmental philosophy and critiques of industrialization. The crucial difference lay in his response. Where scholars advocated discussion, reform, or political action, Ted would eventually embrace violence. That decision separated him completely from legitimate philosophical debate. He believed dramatic acts of destruction could awaken society. Instead, they inflicted irreversible harm upon innocent people. The transformation from isolated writer to serial bomber did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded gradually. Thought became conviction. Conviction became planning. Planning became action. By the late 1970s, the quiet cabin hidden among Montana's forests no longer contained only books, journals, and mathematical ideas. It also concealed the beginnings of something far darker. Inside that tiny room, surrounded by handmade furniture and shelves crowded with notes, Ted began applying the same patience and precision that had once earned admiration from mathematicians to an entirely different purpose. He experimented with mechanical designs, studied materials, and refined techniques that demanded extraordinary attention to detail. Every lesson learned as a scholar now served another objective. Not discovery. Not education. Destruction. The world beyond the mountains had no reason to notice the small cabin. Neighbors occasionally saw a quiet man living alone. Hunters passed through nearby forests. Travelers drove along isolated roads without giving the property a second glance. Nothing about the landscape suggested that one of the most notorious domestic terrorism cases in American history was quietly taking shape within those trees. There were no warning signs. No dramatic declarations. only an isolated man becoming increasingly certain that he alone understood what was wrong with modern civilization. Soon, those convictions would no longer remain confined to handwritten journals hidden inside a remote cabin. They would arrive unexpectedly in mailrooms, university offices, and workplaces across the United States. And with the opening of a single package, America would begin searching for a man no one had ever seen. One of the most unusual aspects of the Unabomber case is that it does not revolve around a single victim. There was no one person whose life defined the entire investigation. No single family carried the full weight of the tragedy. Instead, the bombing campaign reached across nearly 2 decades, touching dozens of lives that had never crossed paths before fate connected them through violence. Professors, graduate students, airline employees, computer store owners, advertising executives, geneticists, and ordinary office workers all became part of the same story without ever meeting one another. They lived in different cities, worked in different professions, dreamed different dreams. Yet they all shared one heartbreaking truth. None of them woke up believing they had been chosen. To understand this case, it is impossible to focus only on the man who built the bombs. Doing so risks turning the story into the biography of a criminal while leaving the people he harmed in the background. The real cost of the Unabombers campaign cannot be measured simply by the number of explosive devices or the length of the investigation. It must be measured in interrupted lives, empty seats at dinner tables, careers forever altered, and families forced to rebuild after moments that lasted only seconds. Before there was an FBI task force. Before there was a nationwide manhunt. There was a university professor walking into work. A graduate student preparing research. An executive sorting through correspondence. A father returning home to his family. The bombing campaign began by attacking ordinary routines. That was its cruelest feature. The victims were not soldiers entering a battlefield. They were people performing everyday tasks. Opening mail. Receiving packages. Doing their jobs. Trusting that the ordinary rhythms of life would continue exactly as they had the day before. One of the earliest victims was Buckley Crist. In May 1978, Crist worked as a professor of engineering at Northwestern University. Like countless professors across America, his office regularly received packages, manuscripts, research materials, and correspondence. Universities thrive on the exchange of ideas, and mailrooms form an invisible network connecting scholars separated by thousands of miles. Nothing about that particular package appeared extraordinary. It had been left in a campus parking lot before eventually making its way toward Crist's office. Because the parcel seemed unfamiliar, campus police officer Terry Marker was asked to examine it. Marker approached the task as routine. Universities occasionally received misplaced deliveries. Packages were returned to their intended recipients every day. There was no obvious reason to suspect danger. When he opened the box, the device exploded. The blast injured his hand and body, making him the first person wounded in what would eventually become a 17-year bombing campaign. It is worth pausing on that moment. History remembers Terry Marker as the first victim of the Unabomber. But before that day, he was simply a campus police officer responding to what appeared to be an ordinary request. He had no reason to believe that a routine part of his work would become a permanent chapter in criminal history. Violence often rewrites lives without warning. A morning that begins with paperwork ends in an ambulance. An ordinary assignment becomes the story people remember forever. Investigators initially struggled to understand what they were dealing with. Was this a personal attack? An isolated incident? A failed attempt against someone specific? There were more questions than answers. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, another explosion shattered any hope that the first incident had been unique. In May 1979, graduate student John Harris opened a package inside Northwestern University. Again, the device exploded. Again, the victim survived but suffered serious injuries. The similarities between the two attacks were impossible to ignore. Someone appeared to be targeting individuals connected to universities. The pattern had begun. At that stage, however, no one imagined it would continue for another 16 years. John Harris represented something the bomber seemed increasingly drawn toward: academic life, research, intellectual institutions. Universities symbolize the pursuit of knowledge, scientific progress, and innovation. Their laboratories and lecture halls produce discoveries that shape medicine, engineering, technology, and countless other fields. Whether Harris himself represented those ideas in the bomber's mind is impossible to know. What is certain is that he became another innocent person caught inside a campaign driven by beliefs he had never chosen to debate. Surviving an explosion is not the end of a victim's story. It is the beginning of another one. Physical wounds require surgeries. Bones heal. Skin slowly recovers. But trauma follows different rules. Many survivors of explosive violence describe ordinary sounds becoming sources of anxiety long afterward. A slammed door. A dropped object. The tearing of cardboard. Familiar sensations become reminders of moments they desperately wish to forget. For victims whose work depended on opening packages, even returning to the office could become emotionally exhausting. Imagine standing before another unopened parcel months after surviving a bombing. Your rational mind tells you the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor. Your memory tells a different story. That conflict can last for years. As investigators searched desperately for patterns, another attack expanded the mystery beyond university campuses. In November 1979, a bomb exploded aboard American Airlines Flight 444 during its journey from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The device malfunctioned before causing the catastrophic damage its builder apparently intended, but it still filled the cabin with smoke and forced an emergency landing. Several passengers suffered injuries related to smoke inhalation. Hundreds more experienced something less visible but equally real. For those aboard the aircraft, an ordinary flight suddenly became a struggle to understand whether they would survive. Commercial aviation depends almost entirely on trust. Passengers trust engineers, pilots, maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, the aircraft itself. The bombing challenged that trust. It demonstrated that someone outside the aviation industry could reach into one of the most carefully regulated environments in modern society. The attack transformed what had appeared to be a series of university-related incidents into something much larger. Now airlines were involved. Federal authorities recognized they faced an offender whose targets could not be neatly categorized. The victims also reflected another disturbing characteristic of the bomber's strategy. Many had never done anything to attract personal hostility. There were no family disputes, no financial conflicts, no revenge rooted in private relationships. The attacks were symbolic rather than personal. People became targets because of what they represented within the bomber's worldview, not because of who they were as individuals. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant almost anyone working within certain professions could become vulnerable without ever knowing why. Fear spread accordingly. University administrators reviewed mail procedures. Airlines increased security measures. Employees learned to approach unfamiliar packages with growing caution. What had once seemed paranoid gradually became practical. Yet for the individuals already injured, policy changes came too late. Their lives had already divided into before and after. Friends visited hospital rooms carrying flowers and uncertainty. Families waited through surgeries wondering how complete recovery might be. Doctors explained injuries measured in tendons, fractures, burns, and damaged nerves. None of them could explain why these particular people had been chosen. That answer remained locked inside the mind of an unknown man living hundreds of miles away in a tiny cabin hidden among the forests of Montana, where another package was already beginning to take shape. The first attacks left investigators searching for patterns. The next attacks confirmed that there was one. By the early 1980s, what had initially appeared to be isolated bombings had evolved into something far more frightening. Somewhere in the United States, an unknown offender was continuing to design increasingly sophisticated explosive devices, carefully selecting targets connected in ways that remained frustratingly difficult to define. For the victims, however, there was nothing abstract about the pattern. Each explosion interrupted a life that had been moving forward only moments before. In May 1982, Patrick C. Fisher, a professor of computer science at Vanderbilt University, received what appeared to be another ordinary package. Fortunately, Fisher became suspicious before opening it himself. Campus officials examined the parcel, and when it was handled by University Secretary Janet Smith, the device exploded, causing serious injuries to her hands and face. Janet had not spent years studying computer science. She was not publishing research papers. She had not taken public positions on technology or industrial society. She was simply doing her job. Like countless administrative staff across universities, she managed correspondence, organized schedules, and handled the endless flow of documents that kept an academic department functioning. The bomb made no distinction. It never asked whether she agreed with the ideas the attacker claimed to oppose. It simply exploded. That is one of the defining characteristics of terrorism. The intended target and the actual victim are not always the same person. Violence spreads beyond its original destination, reaching anyone unfortunate enough to stand nearby. Janet's injuries required extensive medical treatment. Recovery demanded far more than healing wounds. Everyday tasks became difficult. Activities once performed without thought suddenly required patience, therapy, and determination. Behind every medical report stood a family watching someone they loved relearn ordinary movements. The bomber never witnessed those moments. He never saw the frustration of rehabilitation. He never heard conversations between doctors and frightened relatives. His bombs arrived. Their consequences remained with others. Less than a year later, another package reached the University of California, Berkeley. The irony was impossible to ignore. Years earlier, Ted Kaczynski himself had taught mathematics there. Now the university where he had once lectured became one of the institutions affected by his bombing campaign. Professor Diogenes Angelakos opened the parcel. The explosion caused severe injuries to his right hand and face. For an academic, hands are more than ordinary tools. They write. They teach. They demonstrate ideas across blackboards. They turn pages that represent decades of accumulated knowledge. Damage to those hands threatened not only physical health but professional identity. Students waiting outside offices that morning had no idea they were about to witness the aftermath of an explosion. Emergency vehicles arrived. Hallways filled with confusion. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Another university. Another professor. Another bomb. The pattern continued strengthening. Yet investigators still lacked the crucial piece capable of identifying the person responsible. As the years passed, the devices themselves became increasingly sophisticated. Bomb technicians noticed careful craftsmanship unlike anything produced by someone acting impulsively. Components were often handmade rather than commercially manufactured. Wooden parts were carved with precision. Metal pieces fit together so accurately that investigators concluded the builder possessed exceptional patience and technical ability. These observations offered clues about the offender. They also revealed something unsettling. He was learning. Each device reflected accumulated experience. Mistakes became less common. Designs evolved. The bomber treated every attack almost like an engineering problem whose solution could be refined over time. In 1985, the campaign entered an even darker chapter. Until then, every victim had survived. That would change forever. On December 11, 1985, Hugh Scruton arrived at his computer rental store in Sacramento, California. The holiday season had transformed shopping districts into busy places. Decorations hung from storefronts. Customers hurried between errands carrying wrapped gifts and winter coats. Businesses prepared for another ordinary day. Outside Scruton's store sat what appeared to be a discarded piece of wood. It looked harmless. Perhaps construction debris. Perhaps packaging left behind by deliveries. When Hugh moved it, the concealed explosive device detonated. He died almost instantly. He was 38 years old. Unlike earlier victims who endured long recoveries, Hugh never received that opportunity. He never returned home, never shared another meal with family, never unlocked the front door of his business again. His death marked a devastating escalation. The bomber had now taken a life. For Hugh's loved ones, the investigation became deeply personal. Every news conference mattered. Every rumor about a possible suspect offered hope that justice might finally arrive. Every year without an arrest meant another birthday, another holiday, another family gathering with one chair permanently empty. The killer never contacted them. Never explained why Hugh had been chosen. Because Hugh had not been chosen as an individual. He had been selected because his work involved computers. The distinction offered no comfort. To those left behind, philosophical symbolism meant nothing compared to the absence of someone they loved. Only 2 days after Hugh Scruton's murder, another bomb exploded. This time the victim was James McConnell, a psychologist at the University of Michigan. His research assistant, Nicklaus Sweeney, also suffered injuries. Again, lives changed within seconds. Again, investigators rushed toward another scene that looked hauntingly familiar. By now, fear had become part of daily life inside many universities. Mailrooms introduced stricter procedures. Unexpected deliveries attracted immediate attention. Employees learned to examine packages for unusual characteristics before touching them. Even so, no precaution could eliminate every risk. The bomber relied upon unpredictability. He understood that perfect vigilance is impossible to maintain forever. Human beings eventually return to routine. Routine creates opportunity. The psychological burden extended beyond the direct victims. Co-workers who witnessed explosions carried memories long after physical evidence had been removed. Students remembered ambulances racing across campus. Receptionists hesitated before accepting deliveries. Managers wondered whether ordinary mail should now be treated as potential danger. Fear does not require another explosion to survive. It feeds on anticipation. As investigators reconstructed each crime scene, one question grew increasingly urgent. What kind of person could devote years of extraordinary intellectual effort to building devices intended for strangers? The answer refused to fit familiar categories. The bombs displayed remarkable technical skill. The target selection suggested ideological motivation. The patience required implied long-term planning rather than emotional impulsiveness. Everything pointed toward an individual whose intelligence had become detached from empathy. Yet intelligence itself was never the problem. Across America, countless scientists, engineers, professors, and mathematicians devoted equally brilliant minds to improving lives, advancing medicine, designing safer transportation, and expanding human knowledge. The bomber had made a different choice. He had decided that innocent people could become instruments for delivering his message. That decision, and that decision alone, transformed abstract beliefs into murder. For the families of the victims, no investigation, however determined, could reverse what had already happened. Their lives now revolved around surgeries, funerals, rehabilitation, unanswered questions, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, the invisible man responsible would eventually make the one mistake he had managed to avoid for years. Until then, every unopened package carried with it a possibility that no American wanted to imagine. By the late 1980s, the name Unabomber had become associated with a kind of fear that was difficult to explain because the threat itself remained invisible. There was no photograph of the attacker that the public could recognize. No dramatic escape footage. No criminal organization claiming responsibility. There was only a growing collection of damaged lives and a trail of carefully constructed devices that seemed to appear from nowhere. Behind every investigation file was a person. Behind every crime scene photograph was a moment that had existed before the explosion. A person waking up. A person going to work. A person making plans for the future. The bomber's victims were not connected by friendship, family, or conflict. They were connected only by the idea that, in the mind of their attacker, they represented something larger than themselves. That was perhaps the most painful part for those who survived. They were not attacked because of something they had done. They were attacked because of something someone else believed they represented. One of the victims who came to symbolize this reality was Gary Wright. In February 1987, Wright owned a computer store in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like many small business owners during the technology boom of the 1980s, he worked in a field that represented rapid change. Personal computers were becoming increasingly common. Businesses were learning how digital technology could transform everyday operations. The world was moving toward a future that many people viewed with excitement. Wright was part of that future. But to the bomber, that was enough. Outside Wright's store sat a package that appeared unusual. Unlike earlier incidents that occurred inside universities or corporate environments, this attack targeted a small business owner. It showed that the bomber's definition of a symbol was expanding. When Wright opened the package, the device exploded. He survived, but the injuries were severe. The blast caused damage to his hands, face, and body. Once again, a person who had started an ordinary workday found himself suddenly surrounded by emergency responders, medical personnel, and questions that had no immediate answers. Why me? Why here? What did I do? For victims of ideologically motivated violence, those questions are often impossible to answer because the reasoning exists only inside the attacker's mind. The victim's identity becomes secondary. The person becomes a symbol. And symbols do not have the ability to defend themselves. Gary Wright eventually became one of the most visible survivors of the Unabomber attacks. His experience represented a larger truth about the case. The bomber's campaign did not simply target institutions. It reached into ordinary places where people worked, built businesses, and lived their daily lives. The threat was no longer limited to professors or research facilities. It could appear anywhere. The uncertainty became part of the punishment. People could not look at a package and know whether it contained a product, paperwork, or something designed to destroy them. The bomber had weaponized curiosity itself. A package naturally creates a moment of expectation. Someone sends something. Someone receives something. The recipient wonders what is inside. That small human reaction, the desire to open and discover, became the opening the attacker depended upon. By the late 1980s, investigators had developed a clearer understanding of the person they were hunting, even though they still did not know his name. They believed the bomber was highly intelligent. They believed he worked alone. They believed he had strong ideological motivations. They believed he possessed unusual patience and technical ability. But understanding a criminal's characteristics is not the same as finding him. The FBI had investigated countless leads. Hundreds of people had been considered. Some appeared suspicious because of their writings. Others because of their political beliefs. Some because they possessed technical knowledge. But suspicion was not evidence. A person could dislike technology without being a bomber. A person could live alone without being dangerous. A person could criticize modern society without secretly building explosives. The challenge was separating unusual behavior from criminal behavior. Meanwhile, the real bomber continued living his hidden life. The cabin outside Lincoln, Montana, remained his private world. To neighbors, he was simply a strange but quiet man who preferred solitude. He rarely participated in community activities. He avoided unnecessary contact. He appeared uncomfortable with ordinary social interaction. Yet behind that isolation was a person carefully following the developments of the investigation. He read newspapers. He monitored reports. He understood what authorities knew and what they did not know. The investigation itself became a strange relationship between hunter and hunted. The FBI searched for him. He studied the FBI's search. Every public statement revealed information. Every news report provided insight. Every failed attempt to identify him reinforced his confidence. The passage of time became psychologically important. Years without arrest could create the illusion of invincibility. A person who repeatedly escapes consequences may begin believing escape is proof of superiority rather than luck. That belief can become dangerous. By 1993, after several years without an attack, many hoped the Unabomber's campaign had ended. Then the silence broke. In June 1993, 2 bombs were mailed to targets in California. The first went to Professor David Gelernter, a computer scientist at Yale University. Gelernter was a respected researcher whose work involved computer science and artificial intelligence. He represented exactly the type of intellectual figure the bomber appeared to oppose. When Gelernter opened the package, the explosion caused devastating injuries. He survived, but the damage was permanent. The blast destroyed much of one hand and severely injured other parts of his body. A man whose career depended upon writing, teaching, and intellectual work suddenly faced a future shaped by physical limitations. The second bomb that year targeted Charles Epstein, a geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. Again, the target worked in a field associated with scientific advancement. Again, the attack reached into academic life. Again, an innocent person paid the price for an argument they had never chosen. For investigators, the return of the bomber after a long pause created new urgency. The pattern had not ended. It had evolved. The victims were not random. The timing was not random. The message was becoming clearer. The bomber wanted attention. He wanted recognition. He wanted the world to understand his beliefs. But every attempt to communicate came through violence first. This created a disturbing contradiction. The bomber believed he was fighting against a system that treated people like numbers. Yet his own methods reduced human beings into symbols. David Gelernter was not simply a computer scientist. Charles Epstein was not simply a geneticist. Hugh Scruton was not simply a computer store owner. They were fathers, colleagues, friends, and members of communities that changed forever because of one person's decision. The investigation continued. The victim list grew. And with every attack, authorities came closer to understanding one crucial fact. The bomber was not trying to disappear forever. He was preparing to be heard. The next stage of the case would reveal that the most important clue would not come from a bomb fragment, a witness statement, or a fingerprint. It would come from the bomber himself. After years of silence, he would finally step out from behind the explosions and offer the world his own words. And those words would become the path leading directly back to him. The morning began like any other. That was the cruelest detail. For the people who became victims of the Unabomber, there was rarely a dramatic warning before everything changed. No approaching storm. No stranger waiting outside the door. No moment that announced their lives were about to split into 2 separate chapters, the life before the explosion and the life after. The world was still ordinary right up until the moment it was not. A person walked into an office carrying a cup of coffee. A secretary sorted through the morning mail. A professor prepared for another day of lectures and research. A business owner unlocked the doors of a store. The routines were familiar because routines are what make people feel safe. They create the comforting illusion that tomorrow will resemble today. Ted Kaczynski understood that. He understood that people trusted ordinary objects because ordinary objects had never given them a reason not to. A package was supposed to contain something useful. A letter was supposed to contain information. A delivery was supposed to represent connection between one person and another. The bomber transformed those symbols of everyday life into instruments of fear. The attacks did not begin with explosions. They began with deception. A carefully wrapped package. A handwritten address. A harmless appearance. The device inside remained hidden until curiosity completed the final step. By the early 1990s, the Unabomber had already spent more than a decade refining his methods. Investigators had watched the devices evolve from crude early attempts into sophisticated mechanisms that reflected extraordinary technical ability. Each new attack suggested the person responsible was not acting randomly. He was learning, adapting, and becoming more confident. The bombings of 1993 represented a significant escalation. After a 6-year gap since the previous attack, many hoped the Unabomber had disappeared forever. Investigators had no evidence that he had stopped. They only knew there had been silence. In criminal investigations, silence can be misleading. Sometimes it means the offender has changed. Sometimes it means the offender is waiting. For those who had followed the case, the return of the Unabomber felt like an old nightmare returning. The first attack came on June 24, 1993. The target was Professor David Gelernter, a computer scientist at Yale University. At the time, Gelernter was not just another academic. He was known as a respected researcher whose work explored the relationship between computers, information, and human thought. His career represented exactly the kind of technological advancement that Ted Kaczynski opposed. But Gelernter was not a symbol. He was a person. He had a family. He had colleagues who respected him. He had students who looked to him as a mentor. He had spent years building a life around ideas, research, and teaching. That morning, he received a package. Nothing about it announced danger. There was no visible threat. No obvious sign that something terrible was hidden inside. Like countless people before him, he approached it as a normal part of professional life. Then the device detonated. The explosion changed everything in seconds. The physical damage was severe. Gelernter suffered devastating injuries, particularly to his right hand and arm. For someone whose professional life depended heavily on writing, working with computers, and communicating ideas, the injuries carried a significance beyond pain alone. The explosion attacked not only his body. It threatened the tools through which he expressed himself. Medical treatment followed. Surgeries. Recovery. Adaptation. The process of rebuilding a life after such an injury is often invisible to outsiders. News reports focus on the moment of violence, but victims must live with what comes afterward. They must return to ordinary places carrying extraordinary memories. They must answer questions from people who want to understand what happened. They must find ways to move forward while knowing that the past cannot be changed. Gelernter survived. But survival is not the same as returning to the person someone was before. A few days later, another package arrived. This time the target was Charles Epstein, a geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. Epstein was a pioneer in his field, known for research involving genetic disorders. His work focused on understanding human biology and improving medical knowledge. Again, the target represented science. Again, the victim represented nothing personal. Again, an individual was harmed because of an ideology directed at an entire category of people. When Epstein opened the package, the explosion caused serious injuries. The pattern was now unmistakable. The Unabomber was not finished. He had returned with renewed purpose. For investigators, these attacks created a mixture of frustration and urgency. The bomber had disappeared for years, only to emerge with 2 attacks in rapid succession. The long pause had not been retirement. It had been preparation. The FBI examined every detail. The construction methods. The delivery routes. The materials. The similarities between devices. Every piece of evidence reinforced the belief that one person was responsible. But one question remained unanswered. Who? The investigation had entered its most difficult phase. The bomber was highly intelligent. He was disciplined. He was careful. He seemed to understand exactly how much evidence he could leave behind without revealing himself. Each crime scene contained information. But not enough. The devices told investigators about the bomber's abilities. They revealed patience, technical knowledge, attention to detail. But they did not reveal his name. Meanwhile, the victims faced a reality that investigators could never fully understand from evidence reports alone. The world continued moving. News cycles shifted. The public discussed the attacks for a few days before other stories replaced them. But for the people directly affected, the explosion remained present. A sound that could never be unheard. A moment that could never be repeated. A memory permanently attached to a specific date. For families, the questions were often more painful than the answers. Why was this person targeted? Why did someone decide their life was acceptable collateral damage? How could a stranger look at another human being and see only a representation of an idea? The Unabomber's writings would later reveal that he viewed his victims through the lens of his own beliefs. He believed he was attacking systems, institutions, and symbols. But the reality of terrorism is that systems are made of people. Universities are made of professors, students, researchers, and staff. Technology is created by engineers, programmers, and workers. Science is advanced by individuals who dedicate their lives to discovery. The bomber claimed to be fighting against an abstract enemy. In reality, he was hurting human beings. By 1993, investigators understood that the Unabomber wanted more than destruction. He wanted a platform. He wanted the public to know his reasons. The attacks were becoming a form of communication. Every explosion carried an unspoken message. Pay attention. Listen. Take me seriously. But the question remained whether anyone would ever hear the message without another person being injured first. 2 years later, that question would be answered. The Unabomber would make a demand that would transform the entire investigation. He would ask major newspapers to publish his manifesto. He believed his words would spread his ideas. He believed the world would finally understand him. Instead, those words would become the clue that ended his 17-year campaign. The man who had spent nearly 2 decades hiding behind anonymous packages would make his greatest mistake. He would reveal his own voice. And someone who knew that voice would finally recognize it to be why the summer of 1995, the Unabomber case had become something larger than a criminal investigation. It had become a national mystery. For nearly 17 years, Americans had watched a pattern of violence unfold without ever seeing the person responsible. The attacks appeared, disappeared, and returned again. The victims changed. The locations changed. The years passed. But the question remained the same. Who was behind it? The investigators pursuing the case had spent countless hours studying every fragment of evidence. They had reconstructed devices piece by piece. They had interviewed witnesses. They had examined thousands of possible suspects. They had followed leads across the country, only to watch many of them collapse under scrutiny. The Unabomber had survived because he understood one thing better than almost anyone chasing him. He understood patience. He did not need to strike constantly. He did not need to create chaos every week. He could disappear for months or years, allowing fear to fade just enough for people to return to normal life. Then he would return. The next attack always carried the same message. You have not escaped me. On April 24, 1995, a package arrived at the offices of the American Airlines in Sacramento, California. Inside was a bomb. The target was Gilbert Murray, president of the California Forestry Association. When Murray opened the package, the device exploded. He died. Once again, a person who had begun an ordinary workday became the final victim of someone else's war against an idea. Murray was not a powerful government official. He was not a military leader. He was not someone with personal history with the bomber. He was a professional doing his job. His death marked the final killing attributed to the Unabomber. But at the time, no one knew that. Investigators could not look at a crime scene and know it was the last one. Families could not know that their loved ones would be the final names added to the list. The country could only wonder who would be next. For those working the case, the attack created a familiar mixture of anger and urgency. Another victim. Another device. Another reminder that despite years of effort, the person responsible remained free. But something was changing. The bomber's behavior suggested that destruction alone was no longer enough. He wanted recognition. He wanted his ideas presented to the world. In previous attacks, the Unabomber had sometimes included messages with his devices. He sent letters claiming responsibility or explaining his motives. But these communications had been limited. They were fragments of a larger argument. Now he wanted a much larger audience. He wanted newspapers to publish his entire manifesto. The request was extraordinary. A criminal was demanding space in the nation's most influential publications. The question facing investigators and journalists was one of the most difficult ethical decisions of the entire case. Should they give him what he wanted? Would publishing his words encourage more violence? Or could those same words provide the clue needed to identify him? The bomber claimed that if his manifesto was published, he would stop his campaign. It was a promise no one could fully trust. A person who had spent years sending bombs through the mail had already shown that his own moral boundaries were very different from those of society. Yet the possibility remained. If publishing the document saved lives, refusing could carry its own consequences. The FBI became involved in discussions about the potential publication. Eventually, in September 1995, the manifesto was published by major newspapers. The world finally heard the voice behind the bombs. The document was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. It was long, complex, and written in the style of an academic argument rather than a typical criminal confession. It described the author's beliefs about technology, industrial society, human freedom, and psychological suffering. For many readers, the most disturbing aspect was the contrast between the ideas presented and the actions taken. The writing was organized. The arguments were structured. The language appeared intellectual. But behind those carefully arranged paragraphs was the reality that the author had used murder and terror to force people to read his opinions. A manifesto could explain a person's beliefs. It could not erase the suffering caused in pursuit of those beliefs. Millions of people read the document. Most saw it as the work of a dangerous extremist. But one person read it differently. A man named David Kaczynski. David was Ted Kaczynski's younger brother. For years, David had lived a separate life from his brother. He had built his own career, developed relationships, and moved away from the isolated world Ted had chosen. Yet as David read the manifesto, something began to feel familiar. Not the ideas alone. The writing. The rhythm of the sentences. The unusual phrases. The way the author built arguments. It reminded him of letters Ted had written years earlier. At first, David resisted the thought. The possibility was almost impossible to accept. His brother. The quiet mathematician. The person he had known since childhood. Could that same person really be responsible for bombings that had killed and injured strangers across the country? The human mind often struggles when evidence threatens the image we hold of someone we love. David did not immediately accuse his brother. He searched for certainty. He compared writings. He spoke with his wife. He wrestled with the emotional weight of what he was considering. This was not simply a criminal tip. It was a family being forced to confront a terrifying possibility. If Ted was innocent, reporting him could destroy his life. If Ted was guilty, remaining silent could allow more people to be harmed. There was no easy choice. Eventually, David contacted authorities. The investigation changed forever. For years, the FBI had been searching outward. Now, suddenly, they had a name. The person they had been hunting might not be hiding in a large city or underground organization. He might be living exactly as investigators had long suspected. Alone. Remote. Invisible. But even with a name, they still needed proof. A suspicion was not enough. The FBI had learned from years of failure that the Unabomber was careful. They could not rush. They could not allow their excitement to compromise the investigation. Agents began examining Theodore Kaczynski's background. His education. His employment history. His writings. His connections. The pieces slowly began forming a picture. A brilliant mathematician. A former university professor. A man who abandoned conventional life. A person living in isolation in Montana. The profile was no longer an abstract theory. It had become a human being. The same man who had once been celebrated for his intelligence now stood at the center of one of the largest criminal investigations in American history. The irony was difficult to ignore. For 17 years, the Unabomber had hidden behind anonymity. He believed that remaining unknown made him powerful. But when he finally decided to explain himself, he revealed the one thing he could never completely hide: the way he thought. And through that, he revealed who he was. The discovery of Theodore Kaczynski's possible identity changed the entire atmosphere surrounding the investigation. For nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber had existed as an idea more than a person. To the public, he was a shadow. To investigators, he was a carefully constructed profile made from fragments, a highly intelligent individual, likely with advanced technical skills, someone who worked alone, someone patient enough to disappear between attacks. Someone whose writing revealed deep hostility toward modern technology and industrial society. But now that shadow had a name. The possibility that the man behind the bombs was a former mathematics professor living alone in a remote Montana cabin seemed almost too perfectly aligned with the profile investigators had developed. Yet the FBI understood that the most dangerous moment in an investigation is sometimes the moment when investigators believe they have found their answer. Confidence can become carelessness. A theory must still become evidence. The agents could not arrest a person simply because a family member recognized his writing style. They needed confirmation. They needed something that connected Theodore Kaczynski not only to the manifesto, but to the bombs themselves. So they began examining everything. The FBI reviewed his background, searching for details that matched the evidence collected over the years. His education immediately stood out. Mathematics. Academia. A former position at the University of California, Berkeley. A life that had moved from prestigious institutions to complete isolation. The pieces created a disturbing picture. But the strongest evidence was still waiting in the small cabin hidden outside Lincoln, Montana. The place where Ted Kaczynski had created a life far away from the society he claimed to despise. For years, neighbors had known him simply as a quiet man living in the woods. They saw someone who preferred solitude. Someone who avoided unnecessary conversation. Someone who appeared uncomfortable with modern conveniences. The cabin itself reflected the philosophy he had spent years developing. It was small. Primitive. Separated from the outside world. There was no electricity. No running water. No telephone. The lifestyle seemed almost designed to reject the very systems he criticized. To many observers, the cabin appeared like the physical expression of his beliefs. A place where he could live according to his own rules. A place where outside opinions rarely reached him. A place where his ideas could grow without interruption. But on April 3, 1996, that isolation ended. Before sunrise, federal agents moved toward the property. The operation had to be handled carefully. They were not approaching an ordinary suspect. They believed they were approaching a man responsible for years of carefully planned violence. Inside that small structure, investigators found what they had been searching for since 1978. Evidence. Not theories. Not possibilities. Evidence. The cabin contained materials that connected Kaczynski to the Unabomber investigation. Agents discovered writings, bomb-making materials, and a partially completed explosive device. They also found journals that documented thoughts, experiments, and details connected to his campaign. The years of mystery had collapsed into one small room. A place where investigators could finally begin answering questions that had haunted them for 17 years. Who built the bombs? How were they made? Why were the attacks carried out? What drove someone with such extraordinary intellectual ability to choose such destructive actions? The answers were complicated. And they were deeply disturbing. Kaczynski was arrested without the dramatic confrontation many people expected. There was no violent final battle. No desperate escape attempt. The man who had successfully avoided capture for nearly 2 decades was finally taken into custody because of the one thing he had believed would make him understood. His words. The manifesto he had forced the world to read became the path leading authorities back to him. It was one of the great ironies of the case. The Unabomber had spent years eliminating evidence. He had carefully avoided leaving fingerprints. He had constructed devices designed to reveal as little as possible. But he could not hide his own voice. The writing style he considered a weapon became the evidence that exposed him. For the families of victims, the arrest brought a complicated mixture of emotions. There was relief. After years of uncertainty, the person responsible was finally known. There was also pain. An arrest could not restore what had been lost. It could not return loved ones. It could not erase injuries. It could not remove the memories survivors carried. Justice would come through the courts. Healing would take a different path. For investigators, the arrest represented the conclusion of an extraordinary search. But the case was not finished. A trial awaited. A courtroom would become the next battlefield, not with explosives, but with arguments over responsibility, mental state, ideology, and punishment. The defense would attempt to explain Kaczynski's actions through the lens of his psychological condition. Prosecutors would focus on the choices he made and the lives he destroyed. The world would hear more about the man behind the name. Not the myth. Not the mysterious figure from newspaper headlines. The person. The mathematician. The former professor. The isolated man who transformed his beliefs into violence. The trial would force America to confront uncomfortable questions. Can extraordinary intelligence exist alongside profound cruelty? Can a person create sophisticated ideas while making morally devastating choices? How should society respond when someone uses intellectual ability to justify harming others? But before the courtroom arguments began, there was another reality that deserved attention. The victims. For years, the public fascination with the Unabomber had often centered on the mystery of the attacker. Who was he? How did he evade capture? How could someone accomplish so much while remaining hidden? Those questions were understandable. But they risked pushing the victims further into the background. The people who survived the attacks did not experience the case as a mystery. They experienced it as trauma. They did not care about the bomber's theories. They cared about recovery. They cared about family. They cared about rebuilding lives that had been changed forever. A criminal case may end with a verdict. A victim's journey does not. The explosion is only one moment. The consequences can last decades. As Theodore Kaczynski entered the legal system, the country prepared to hear his explanation. But no explanation could change the central truth of the case. The Unabomber was not discovered because his bombs failed. He was not found because investigators finally uncovered some hidden physical mistake. He was found because, after years of silence, he chose to speak. And in speaking, he revealed the most personal evidence of all. The pattern of his own mind. The 17-year hunt for the Unabomber was over. But the struggle to understand what had happened was only beginning. When an explosion is over, the silence that follows is unlike any other. It is not true silence. There are voices calling for help. The sharp crackle of damaged wiring. The distant wail of approaching sirens. Pieces of shattered glass settling onto concrete. The confused questions of people who have not yet understood what they have just witnessed. But beneath all of that is another kind of silence. The silence left behind by certainty disappearing. Only seconds earlier, the room had been ordinary. A desk. A chair. Stacks of papers waiting to be signed. A package sitting where someone had placed it without a second thought. Then everything changed. Investigators entering one of the Unabomber crime scenes faced a challenge unlike almost any other. An explosion destroys evidence at the exact moment it creates a crime. The very act investigators needed to understand had also erased much of the information that could explain it. Every fragment mattered. Every splinter. Every twisted piece of metal. Every tiny section of wire. Nothing was too small to collect. Nothing could be dismissed as meaningless. Because somewhere among thousands of damaged pieces lay the identity of a man no one had ever seen. Crime scene technicians approached each location with extraordinary patience. Long after ambulances had left and the injured had been transported to hospitals, investigators remained. Hours turned into entire days. Photographs documented every angle before a single object was moved. Measurements were taken repeatedly. Evidence markers slowly covered floors, sidewalks, offices, and mailrooms where only hours earlier people had been working ordinary jobs. To an outsider, the scenes appeared chaotic. To experienced investigators, they contained structure. An explosion follows physical laws. Pressure moves outward. Fragments travel according to force. Damage tells a story. The challenge was learning how to read it. One of the first observations investigators made concerned the remarkable craftsmanship of the devices. These were not bombs assembled carelessly in moments of anger. They reflected planning, precision, patience. Many components had been made by hand rather than purchased ready-made. Wooden boxes were carefully carved. Metal parts were shaped individually. Even the smallest pieces suggested someone unwilling to rely upon commercially manufactured materials if they could instead create something unique. That choice complicated the investigation enormously. Most criminals leave traces by purchasing supplies, receipts, store records, manufacturing marks, serial numbers. The Unabomber deliberately eliminated many of those opportunities. If a component could be made inside his own workshop, he preferred making it himself. The bombs themselves became fingerprints. Not because they contained literal fingerprints. Because each one carried habits unique to its builder. Investigators noticed recurring design choices. The same careful construction. The same attention to concealment. The same preference for handmade components. Each recovered device strengthened the conclusion that a single individual stood behind the attacks. That realization narrowed one question while expanding another. If one person possessed this level of technical skill, who was he? Bomb technicians studied every recovered fragment under magnification. Small cuts in would reveal the kinds of tools that had been used. Tiny scratches suggested the direction blades had moved across surfaces. Chemical analysis identified explosive materials. Engineers reconstructed triggering mechanisms piece by piece until destroyed devices began taking shape again on laboratory tables. The work demanded enormous concentration. Sometimes weeks passed before investigators understood the function of a single damaged component. Patience became essential. The bomber had spent months building each device. The investigators would spend months taking it apart. One detail soon captured particular attention. Several wooden components contained letters carved into them. At first glance they looked meaningless. Simple initials. Random markings. Eventually investigators realized they were intentional. The letters often formed the initials FC. No one knew what they meant. Theories multiplied. Perhaps they represented the bomber's name. Perhaps a political organization. Perhaps a philosophical idea. Perhaps nothing at all. Years later, investigators would conclude the letters likely stood for Freedom Club, a name Kaczynski invented for the revolutionary movement he imagined would one day oppose industrial society. But during the investigation, FC remained another mystery among dozens of others. Evidence accumulated faster than answers. The FBI established what would become one of the largest and longest-running investigations in its history. The case received the designation Unabomber, a name derived from the early targets connected to universities and airlines. Eventually, the media transformed that investigative abbreviation into the nickname that would become internationally recognized. Unabomber. The name spread quickly. Ironically, it gave an anonymous criminal an identity before authorities ever discovered his real one. With every attack, the evidence rooms grew fuller. Shelves filled with labeled bags. Boxes containing metal fragments. Photographs arranged chronologically across walls. Maps marked with colored pins identifying bombing locations. Timelines stretched across conference rooms. The investigation became enormous. Hundreds of agents contributed. Laboratories across the country examined evidence. Behavioral specialists developed profiles. Postal inspectors analyzed mailing patterns. Local police departments coordinated with federal investigators. The amount of work invested in the case became almost impossible to measure. Yet despite those resources, one frustrating reality remained unchanged. The bomber continued disappearing after every attack. He left behind destruction. He rarely left behind himself. Witnesses provided little help. Most victims never saw the bomber. Packages arrived through the mail or appeared unexpectedly. Any person who had delivered them had already vanished. Descriptions varied wildly. A man wearing sunglasses. Someone carrying a backpack. An unfamiliar face near a campus. None proved reliable enough to identify a suspect. Human memory struggles under stress. Investigators understood that. Witnesses sincerely reported what they believed they had seen. Unfortunately, sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. The lack of eyewitness evidence forced investigators to depend increasingly upon forensic science. Every improvement in laboratory technology offered new hope. Perhaps this time a microscopic fiber would reveal something. Perhaps a chemical impurity would identify a supplier. Perhaps a tool mark would connect multiple devices. Hope rose. Hope faded. Again and again. The Unabomber seemed almost impossibly careful. He avoided leaving fingerprints. He minimized biological evidence. He handled materials in ways that frustrated conventional forensic methods. Every successful attack suggested he understood not only bomb construction but criminal investigation itself. Whether he had formally studied forensic procedures remains uncertain. What is clear is that he anticipated many of the techniques investigators would use. That anticipation prolonged the case year after year. Inside FBI offices, frustration quietly grew. Not because investigators lacked determination. Because determination alone cannot replace evidence. They knew someone was responsible. They knew he was making mistakes somewhere. They simply had not yet discovered which mistake would finally matter. Meanwhile, another package could already be moving through the mail. Another victim could already have been chosen. The pressure was relentless. Every unsolved attack increased public fear. Every passing month without an arrest raised new questions about whether the bomber might remain invisible forever. The crime scenes revealed almost everything about how the bombs worked. They revealed almost nothing about the man who built them. Somewhere beyond the twisted metal and shattered wood was a quiet cabin, a workbench, and a solitary figure patiently preparing the next device while hundreds of investigators searched for clues hidden inside the last one. As the years passed, the evidence collected from the Unabomber crime scenes began to resemble pieces from an enormous puzzle with no picture on the box. Each new bombing added another handful of fragments. A bent nail. A section of copper wire. A carefully carved wooden panel. A handwritten label. A damaged battery. A broken spring. Individually, none of them revealed the identity of the person responsible. Together, they began to reveal something far more valuable. A personality. Investigators eventually realized they were not simply studying explosive devices. They were studying habits. Every craftsman develops habits over time. A carpenter reaches for certain tools without thinking. A painter applies brushstrokes in familiar ways. A musician unconsciously returns to rhythms practiced for years. The Unabomber displayed the same kind of consistency. He favored handmade wooden components. He assembled mechanisms with extraordinary precision. He repeatedly used similar construction techniques even as the designs evolved. These choices were not random. They reflected the routines of one individual working alone. Behavioral analysts found this especially significant. Many bombers rely heavily on commercially available materials because they are faster and easier to obtain. Ted Kaczynski did the opposite. Whenever possible, he modified or fabricated parts himself. The decision was practical from an investigative standpoint because it reduced traceable purchases. But it also suggested something deeper. He appeared to take personal satisfaction in creating every aspect of the device. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was delegated. Every bomb became an expression of his craftsmanship. That craftsmanship made the investigation both easier and harder. Easier because the similarities confirmed a single offender. Harder because handmade components rarely led back to manufacturers or suppliers. There were no factory records pointing toward a suspect. Only the quiet consistency of one unknown builder. Inside FBI laboratories, specialists spent countless hours reconstructing devices from shattered remains. Imagine receiving thousands of tiny fragments collected from an explosion powerful enough to destroy the object you are trying to understand. Now imagine attempting to determine exactly how that object looked before it exploded. That was the work facing bomb technicians. Tables disappeared beneath carefully labeled evidence. Pieces smaller than a fingernail were photographed, measured, and compared against components recovered years earlier. Gradually, patterns emerged. The triggering mechanisms shared common design philosophies. The placement of certain parts remained remarkably consistent. The construction revealed someone who valued reliability over unnecessary complexity. The bomber learned from every previous attack. When one design proved effective, he refined it rather than abandoning it. Investigators also discovered another important characteristic. The devices reflected remarkable mechanical intelligence but relatively simple manufacturing methods. There were no expensive industrial machines involved. No advanced laboratories. No specialized factory equipment. The bombs could have been assembled in a modest workshop using ordinary hand tools. That realization shifted the investigation. Instead of searching for someone with access to sophisticated industrial facilities, agents increasingly considered the possibility that the offender worked entirely alone in a private location. The profile slowly evolved. Highly intelligent. Technically skilled. Comfortable with manual craftsmanship. Patient. Meticulous. Likely living a solitary life. It was an impressive profile. Unfortunately, it still described thousands of people across the United States. Another area of investigation focused on the materials themselves. Chemical experts analyzed explosive compounds recovered from different scenes. Metallurgists studied the origin of metal fragments. Wood specialists examined grain patterns and cutting techniques. Even glue residues attracted attention. Nothing escaped examination. If the bomber purchased unusual supplies, perhaps investigators could trace them. If he reused uncommon materials, perhaps they would point toward a location. Again and again, promising theories faded. Most components came from common sources available throughout the country. The bomber deliberately avoided materials that would easily identify him. He understood that ordinary objects attract less attention than unusual ones. The investigation expanded beyond physical evidence. Linguists joined the effort. Behavioral scientists reviewed letters received from the bomber. Psychologists examined target selection. Cartographers studied geographical patterns. Statisticians searched for mathematical regularities in attack timing. Every discipline contributed something. None delivered the answer. For the investigators leading the case, frustration became a constant companion. The problem was never a lack of effort. It was the extraordinary discipline of the offender. Every major investigative breakthrough seemed to end one step short of identification. A witness remembered seeing someone near a crime scene. The description proved too vague. A potential suspect possessed technical knowledge. The evidence failed to connect him. A promising theory explained several attacks. The next bombing contradicted it. Years of work produced mountains of information. Still, the bomber remained invisible. Inside FBI headquarters, conference rooms filled with maps. Colored pins marked every known bombing. Strings connected locations. Dates covered whiteboards. Photographs of recovered components lined entire walls. Investigators stood before those displays searching for relationships that might have been overlooked. What connected Chicago to California? Why universities? Why airlines? Why computer stores? Why long periods of silence followed by sudden violence? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Behavioral profilers reached several conclusions that would later prove remarkably accurate. They believed the bomber probably possessed a high level of education. They suspected he harbored deep resentment toward modern society. They believed he preferred isolation. They concluded he likely worked alone. Those assessments reflected careful analysis rather than guesswork. Yet even correct conclusions do not automatically identify a person. A profile narrows possibilities. Evidence identifies individuals. The breakthrough investigators desperately needed still refused to appear. Meanwhile, every attack left another group of victims facing challenges no laboratory could solve. Physical rehabilitation demanded months or years. Some survivors lost the use of hands that had once defined their professions. Others carried scars visible every time they looked into a mirror. Many developed understandable anxiety surrounding unexpected deliveries. The investigation existed in two separate worlds. One world consisted of evidence bags, laboratory reports, and investigative meetings. The other consisted of hospitals, rehabilitation centers, family living rooms, and quiet moments when survivors realized life would never return to exactly what it had been. Those worlds rarely intersected. Investigators searched for justice. Victims searched for normality. Both journeys required extraordinary patience. As the case entered the mid-1990s, one uncomfortable possibility began emerging inside investigative circles. Perhaps the evidence hidden inside bomb fragments would never be enough. Perhaps the answer would have to come from somewhere entirely different. Not from metal. Not from wood. Not from chemical residues. But from the bomber himself. If he ever decided to communicate more openly, he might reveal what years of forensic work had failed to uncover. No one could predict how accurate that intuition would become. Because while investigators continued examining shattered pieces of explosive devices, the Unabomber was sitting alone in his cabin writing something far more revealing than any bomb he had ever built. He was writing a document that he believed would change the world. Instead, it would change the investigation.